Good evening, good evening. Good evening, good evening. I'm just getting settled in. Get us started for the night. Yes, it's something I hear asked a lot, so I thought we could touch on it because, it's actually a touchy subject that it's not one that I, but, so, you will when I'm done, I promise. If you stick around and listen, I promise. I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit. So, my name is Sarah, and I am a Witta, and I teach paleoanthropology, and I teach kind of animism and pre-stratification and who we were before. And so tonight, that's one of the things that we're going to talk on and touch on. We'll probably have comments off for the vast majority of the live, but when we have comments off, I will turn them back on for questions. This is a new topic for me. We've been talking about other topics like Homo erectus and the other species that Homo erectus speciated into and such. And so as a first time, it's going to probably be not as good as you think, right? Like, thank you. I appreciate that, Brittany, but maybe not as good as you think because it is a testing ground, right? It is a very controversial topic. And there's yay, Dee's here. And it's a controversial topic, but it'll cover a whole lot of grounds. And it might not mean exactly what you think it means, but we'll be talking about it, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the comments just so that I am not too distracted, okay? Also, because of the touchiness of it, it might get very troll heavy, and so I want to make sure. But I will turn them back on. If you've been in my lives before, you know that. We're going to go ahead and go with it. Oh, I'm so sorry. I just got on, Jesse. So this is an experiment. This is the first time I'm doing this topic. It will be done again, Jesse. It'll probably be done better next time, just saying, because... but I'll turn them off. And then I will also upload this to YouTube, so it will be on my YouTube channel. Okay, so often we see the question, often, something happens that is just particularly stupid, and we see the question, well, why is white, or phrased that way, but often we see this phrased in many other ways. Often we see it phrased as white being an evolutionary advantage, that people think that it's an evolutionary advantage, right? And so the phrase of why do we have white skin? But we also see this in the context of why Western culture, right? Because Western culture is very much associated with Europe, even though it stems out of the Near East and the Middle East. But because it's so associated with Europe, Western culture has become very much what we might consider to be European culture, which can be associated with white. But I would say, though, that when people are talking more about white culture, that the conversation about white culture is not necessarily having to do with skin color at this point, right? Or even a place of origin. It has to do with a specific culture that when I see it referred to, I'm seeing it referred to here in the United States. So it might be more so within the United States than somewhere else, but a specific idealism of exploitation and plasticity and eating more, taking more, the most that I can get, how much more can I get, right? Why are you whining at me? Sorry. If you're new here, my dog can be very distracting. Sometimes I easily distract. Anyways, so I want to go into kind of all of that, and I want to discuss kind of all of that because I think that discussion is important. And I think that discussion is important in how we can understand how to dismantle things and understand what things really truly are, and understand ourselves better and move forward, right? So I think that this is an important thing to dismantle. And I think that it's important for everybody. I think it's important on some levels for... well, I think it's important on many levels for many different people for many different reasons. Some of them being, for people who look like me, it's very important to understand how you're perceived and how your behavior is perceived and how things come across to other people, whether you intend them to or not. And if you do intend them to come across that way, why that might be wrong or problematic or have issue. For people that don't look like me, that might not have this applied, because there are people who don't look like me that white culture absolutely applies to, because again it is viewed here in the US as more plasticity and more exploitative, but so you can be any skin color and have it applied to the way that your behavior is, and I want to specify that. But it might be the effect of understanding maybe why people are doing the shit we do, though I'm not saying you don't already understand, right? I'm really not saying you don't already understand, but maybe having further historical understanding that might not be as prevalent, and maybe seeing it as, anyways. So we're going to have the conversation. Well, I guess more of a lecture because it's not that much of a conversation. Again, we will open the comments back up so that the questions can be asked. But what I want to start with, first of all and foremost, is the fact that race has been debunked. There is no such thing. Race is a cultural construct. Race is a societal. In fact, I actually like the term societal construct over cultural construct, because it has more to do with a society than it has to do with culture, because society is like your country, the broader scheme that is controlled further without of you, whereas your culture is the inner space. Like, your culture may be Pacific Northwest, whereas your society may be the United States. Okay, and so I would like to state that I do believe societal construct is a much better way to state it, and absolutely a much better way in which race and the theory of race comes into play. And how the theory of race comes into play really comes into the question of why is white, right? And so we're going to get into it on quite a few levels, but I want to get into just a couple of things really quick. Up front, in front, everything else. And those couple of things really quick is the fact that the idea that we are separated by our skin color or by some internal thought processes of us being different human beings is extremely new. It's about 530 plus years of occupation at Turtle Island new, because we really don't see the construct of race and the thought process that race has something to do with anything, or that a different color of your skin or a different place that you're at has anything to do with whether or not you have different abilities genetically come into play until after we see Turtle Island, which we will go into a little bit more later on when we talk about the concept of othering. But I want to say that that's where it starts. We don't see the theory of race, the idea scientifically that there might be biological differences within us, come into play until we see science come back to Europe, because Europe didn't have science from 400 Common Era to about 1600, again, after Turtle Island was just landed on, invaded, occupied. We don't see science return into Europe until about 1600. So because it's gone during that extended period of time, and their lack of understanding of what science truly is, and their lack of bias in their confirmation bias in their thought processes, when we see the theory of race starting to develop within early European science, what we see is a very biased theory starting to develop. This theory is meant to keep justification in place for the trauma that Europeans are committing against people that they know are just as good as them, in fact, better. right? They could justify, before fighting people in different countries because of different religions, but they knew that the people of Africa were scientifically and medically advanced. They just called it a sin because Africa's gods, from Islam to other gods within Africa, allowed science and medicine, where Christianity's God did not allow science and medicine, so they could attribute it to sin and they attribute it to a religion, but they know that they are advanced. And they can see that Turtle Island indigenous people are advanced because Europeans are living in dirty cities. They're diseased. They were the ones that brought syphilis to Turtle Island. Screw the rest of it. Syphilis is found in 1300 in Europe, so predating Turtle Island. With this, we see that they need justification for their horror. And so their need of justification for their horror means that they turn around and they decide to invent a theory that justifies it, right? Our new science, that's the best science because we take it from Greeks and Aristotle, and we're the greatest. And they need to justify that, and they need to put themselves on top. And so in their need to put themselves on top, you see that what they do is create this based on really artistic calipers and artistic, fucking shades and things like that, and their perceptions. And they decide that very surface level attributes go way, way deeper into the bones and the blood and everything else. And this theory persists in so many ways for quite a long time. Again, we see the justification. We see this damaging not only Turtle Island indigenous people and black people who are brought to Turtle Island, but also white Europeans who are also forced sterilized. All of Hitler's Holocaust tactics were practiced in the United States before they were practiced in Germany because, the United States has the best racism, and that's why Germany and the apartheid took it from us. So all of these things were practiced against everybody, not just Turtle Island indigenous people and not just black people. And again, that does not mean that those atrocities were not worse on so many levels. I just want to point out to you that it doesn't just hurt other people, it hurts fucking everybody. That's all. That's why. Okay, so please don't go, well, we too. Yes, some, because they deemed you as not good enough, and if it was your grandparents, then you wouldn't be here, if your grandparents were sterilized, right? So you see this theory taking over. When you see science starting to actually expand and starting to actually take in other voices and actually look outside of the ancient Greeks who were fucked from tip to toe in their science, please let me expound upon that over and over, which we will as we go further. When you see that we have new inventions. We have the ability to do DNA. We have the ability to do things like the full genome, there's a World Genomic Sequence thing. The World Genome Project, sorry. Anyways, we have the ability to do things like that. And when we get the ability to do that, we see that genetically you are more different than your next door neighbor than you are from somebody in a completely different population across the globe. That genetically we have more genetic difference within populations than we do between populations. And this is really important. Not only is it really important because it debunks race, but I'm going to give you a second logically to think about the fact that you need a genetic difference within a population, otherwise you become inbred, and that's how we lost the Neanderthals. So it makes sense that you have a great genetic or less genetic diversity. A greater genetic diversity within your population than you do between populations. You need that greater genetic diversity within your population so that nobody becomes inbred. Okay? So logically, in and of itself, to survive as a species, we have to have greater genetic diversity within populations than between them anyways. That said, we will go into all of that further, but we want to make sure up front, double this down. Race does not exist. Culture exists. Absolutely. Culture exists. In many places it's thriving. In many places it's fighting to thrive, and it should be allowed to thrive because culture is important. Culture is ancestry. Culture is soul. Culture is about the shared experiences that people go through. Okay, culture exists. Not only does culture exist, but very unfortunately, racism exists. And in many countries, the structure is built upon the theory of race and the theory that Western science, Western ideology, Western thought process is the supreme thought process. And when we have this idea that Western thought process is the supreme thought process and we ignore all the other thought processes, we're taking into supremacy this thought process that is extremely confirmation bias confirmed all the time. It doesn't like to look outside itself because it sinks back into the idea of this God that's a jealous God, right? But it sinks further back into that othering, okay? So, I want to double down that race does not exist up front. Why is white is written on a picture of a man who does not look white to anybody, right? This is Cheddarman. Cheddarman was, until this year, the oldest find we have within Britain. This year we actually have two finds that predate him, one at 13,000 years ago and one at 14,000 years ago, and Cheddarman is 10,000 years ago. Cheddarman belonged to a group that looked pretty much like him, that is the parenting population of about 10% of current Europeans. And Cheddarman actually has a direct descendant that currently lives in Britain today. He also has people that are related to him, like haplogroup wise and stuff like that. I actually have the haplogroups, and my haplogroup comes from him. And actually, I have a gene for dark skin, right? That actually comes down along those lines. So he has a dominant gene of dark skin and a dominant gene of blue eyes. And the population that Cheddarman was a part of had the dominant gene for dark skin and the dominant gene for blue eyes. And when they say the dominant gene for dark skin, they have classified it as sub-Saharan. Okay, so before you're like, well, that could be like Middle Eastern. We're classifying it as sub-Saharan. Okay, so the dominant gene for dark skin and the dominant gene for light eyes. Him and the group of people that he belongs to is part of an intense study as to why light eyes happen to become a part of the European population before light skin becomes a part of the European population. We've talked before a little bit about Homo sapiens moving out of Africa and about their mixing and their breeding with some other populations. And we've talked about how Homo sapiens really lived in the Levant for about 100,000 years and really mixed with Neanderthals within there. And the Neanderthals were really the only ones up in Europe during that time. And the Homo sapiens were in the Levant at this time. So they would go back to Africa, but they're not really going up into Europe because the climate in Europe at this time is not really meant for them. We do see that you start to see that first coming out and leaving the Levant at 65,000 years ago to 70,000 years ago with the indigenous people of Australia. But you don't see that moving anywhere else until 50,000 years ago. And what you see 50,000 years ago is very much still near the Levant and starting to spread out. You get a little bit over the top of the Mediterranean, kind of like hump in there where the sea stretches up and, you know, up into where Byzantine was. Sorry, my geography is really ancient sometimes or really modern sometimes, and all jacked up every time. But over that hump, you know, you get a little bit up in there about 50,000 years ago, but you're really not seeing any northern push until a lot later because the Ice Age starts ending about 50,000 years ago and it starts pushing up. No. Well, so I'm going to say it starts ending about 50,000 years ago. It doesn't start even leaving Britain, the continent of Britain, or the island of Britain, until about 27,000 years ago. It hasn't completely left Britain until 10,000 years ago, okay? And it hasn't left Scandinavia until 8,000 years ago. Okay, so you have this push up of the ice that comes way later. And so you're not seeing Homo sapiens up in Europe until after this last ice age. And that's how we know where you start to see Homo sapiens in Europe. But we also see that the Homo sapiens in that first push up into Europe are very dark skinned. Well, they may have mixed with the Neanderthals. Whatever light skinned things that they got from the Neanderthals are not a presence that's a presence yet. We do see that some reason the lighter eyes come into play earlier. We have talked in here about the lighter eyes being a low light adaptation. It could be that the light eyes were a very dominant gene with Neanderthal, but that the Neanderthal, who also has a dark skin gene, actually were kind of a little bit more light and dark mixed, right? And so, and if that's the case, it could be that the light gene wasn't a dominant gene within Neanderthal, but it was just more of a kind of co-dominant, or maybe it was even a recessive and the dark was a little bit. We don't know exactly, right? So it could be any combination of that. But we do know that we don't start seeing that light skin really coming into play for quite a bit of time. I'd like to point out that Cheddarman is 10,000 years ago. His descendant that is currently alive today is 300 generations apart from him. So it takes 100 generations for an adaptation. 2,500 years is generally what we think of that is. Okay, but with his descendant being 300 generations, you have to think of that adaptation having 300 years. Okay, so it's gone through that first 100 years, and then this has adapted for that next 100 years, and then this has adapted, or generations, and then this has adapted for the next 100 generations, which is why we can see ultra light, almost translucent skin these days up in some Scandinavian areas, right? Up in some Celtic areas, because of the fact that there's 300 generations out of adaptation within this space. But again, we're looking at this color skin for that first 100 generations, really, right? You're going to see it start to get lighter. You're going to start to see it getting noticeably lighter, maybe at about 50 generations, but really only if you're like comparing start to last, right? You're not going to see some huge distinguishing lighter skin until way later. We know that as groups are moving up into areas, that they are being settled by people who are dark-skinned with light eyes. We even know that within Scandinavia, it was settled by two groups, one being dark-skinned and light-eyed, just like Cheddarman behind me, and one being light-skinned and brown-eyed, okay? When we see this movement up, and we see them settling into these areas, we're seeing them settling in quite dark for quite some time. Again, light skin has to do not with an evolution, a move forward. Light skin has to do with the fact that we as Homo sapiens have this advantage to kind of chameleon our skins after 100 generation. The melanin content in our skin has the ability to adapt based on the amount of vitamin D that we can get from the sun, right? If we're getting a huge amount of vitamin D from the sun, we're going to protect ourselves from overdosing on that vitamin D from the sun. And if we are getting no vitamin D from the sun, we're going to get lighter and lighter and lighter because we're struggling to get that vitamin D, right? Vitamin D does not only come from the sun. There are other sources, right? So as you're struggling to adapt, you might be eating fruits or vegetables to be able to get that vitamin D content and, you know, still be able to move forward, right? So it's not going to be this overnight adaptation. You're going to see that this takes longer. And you're not going to see it as an evolutionary advantage, because if you then take that lighter skin and deposit it back in sub-Saharan Africa, you are going to burn the fuck out of yourself and you're not going to live through it, right? Like your next generation's not going to even be able to be born because you're, first of all, you can't see very well because of the eyes. And second of all, your skin is going to blister, right? And then, you know, cancer is going to be way more prevalent, right? Because there's not that protection from the UV, right? Now, do not let that make you think on any level that having dark skin does not mean you sunburn, because you can absolutely sunburn with dark skin. It's just a protective layer. It doesn't do the whole fucking job, right? It's not like iron, right? So, it is not an advantage across the whole space that we are in as a species to have light skin, and therefore it is not an evolutionary advantage. It is not something that will move us forward evolutionarily as a species. Okay? So do not take light skin as being an advancement along the evolutionary trail, because not only can you go to light skin, but you can go from light skin to dark skin. Okay? If you go from Sweden 1,000 years ago even, if you went to from Sweden 1,000 years ago and you're lighter skin and you do get into Africa and you are able to, I mean, you can make it to Africa easily enough, but you do get into Africa with a group of people and you are able to cover your skin light enough, not having the major adaptations that we have now, you will probably, well, you're definitely going to get darker within a couple thousand years. The only probably is they did still have houses. So you might see a little bit less, right? If you're going to go further back when you don't have as much indoor activity as we do have even 1,000 years ago, you might see that it goes a lot faster, right? Just because of the fact that you have to have that adaptation faster when you haven't adapted the environment to yourself instead, which is our evolutionary advantage, that we can adapt our environment to ourselves, right? And we have this adaptation skill in our melanin content in our skin, which is an amazing adaptation for Homo sapien to have, right? That Homo erectus had, that Homo Neanderthal had, but it is never the skin tone itself that is the advantage. It's only an advantage in a certain specific space on this planet. So this is why we start to see lighter skin starting to develop, because it does give you that advantage of higher vitamin D when you are in a space that has heavy cloud cover, right? And again, we have that miraculous ability to adapt, right? And so you do see this adaptation. This adaptation takes place in several different spaces across the globe, and it takes place in several different groups. You will see that Turtle Island indigenous people can be light-skinned at a very high northern latitude, just like you will see Turtle Island indigenous people will be very dark-skinned along the equator, right? You will see the same thing in Eurasia, where you're going to get lighter skin the higher and more Siberian you go. On average, that doesn't mean all the time. I am aware, before you point them out, I am aware. But on average, you see that you're going to get lighter skin. If you're in that more northerly climate, when you're up in the ice all the time, when you're up in the snow all the time, right? And so you're going to see that this goes across the globe. Again, it's that morphing ability that we have that is the advantage, not which color, not whichever color you've decided to choose, right? So we do see light skin starting to come, and we see light skin, going from sub-Saharan black over, 100 generations, probably to what we would think of as maybe North African, right? And then after that, you're going to see it getting to something you would see today as probably Mediterranean, right? And then you're going to get to the ultralight that you can get in certain spaces today. So throughout this time, you're not seeing this division based on the color of somebody's skin, because the color of somebody's skin isn't a divisive factor. And again, if you've been around for my lectures before, or my discussions before, the lectures before, the discussions before, you'll have heard that, we see, sorry, I got distracted on legends. Oh, hold on, I totally lost it. I'm sorry. That is, unfortunately, the ADHD brain. I said something right before Legends, and we were talking, and I lost the entire train of thought of what it was for like the minute or two before that. Division of colors. Okay, thank you. Thank you, I appreciate it, everybody. I'm so sorry. So when we're talking about seeing that division of color, you're not seeing it beforehand. And the reason that you're not seeing it beforehand, if you've been around and we've talked before, everybody, as Homo sapien is leaving Africa, Homo sapien literally decides to have sex with every other species it sees. I don't want to get too deep into how we have different species and how we can tell different species, but we have 7 different species that we can see within the Homo sapiens across the globe, from every corner of the globe, okay? And these different species are all going to be species that come down from Erectus, and these different species are all going to be species that we bred with along the way, like we did with Neanderthal. Neanderthal and Denisovian are 2 of them. We have something called ghost species. Ghost species are something we see in our DNA, but we don't see it in the fossil record. I get into it deeper in other things. I don't want to get into it too deep and distract. But because of this, we've been around for 300,000 years. It takes about 10,000 years to get the smallest amount, which is at 0.02, 100,000 years to get some of the larger amounts. That's 100,000 years of interbreeding, frequent interbreeding. Anytime we saw something different, we didn't fight it, we fucked it. That's just what we do. Ooh, you look hot. Oh, we contrast well. Oh, I've never seen eyes like that before. That is who we are as a species. Every time we see something new and interesting, we don't fight it, we fuck it. We do not see any evidence of violence even in the human fossil record. The human fossil record, going back to Homo habilis, the human fossil record, any evidence of violence between human species until 10,000 years ago, and then it's only one species left anyways, it's just us. It's only in 10,000 years ago that we start to see any level of violence between different groups of people, okay? So up until then, if we see something new, we don't fight it, we fuck it, okay? And even up until more recently, in many spaces, we see the same kind of behavior. We don't see the need to fight everything until we start to see ownership, until we start to see the need to control things, until we start to see stratification and kings, okay? So, when we see Homo sapiens spreading across Europe in the beginning, we're seeing people who are a mix of colors. Probably you're going to see much more darker coming through. You might see occasionally lighter coming through. You're going to be mixing with anything you see. Those blue eyes are going to be cool, especially in that dark skin, but you're going to see something else that's really cool. It's not going to really matter. This stays happening until 700 Common Era Viking time, where I know of 3 graves in Britain that have African people within them. One is a girl who is 33% West African. One is and was buried with her family, who were all Central Northern European. And then there are 2 men within Viking graves that are Viking men that are Sub-Saharan African. So we know that there is this mixing of everybody coming around, and culture, and just, we want to think that these are isolated groups, and they're not. They're not. Every evidence, every new thing that you see, right? If you listen to the old stories, absolutely, but every new thing that you see shows that everybody is doing this. Oh, I've got this new thing, I'm going to take it up there and I'm going to show it. I got this thing and I want to go that way. Ooh, I know that somebody over there said something about this. Oh, I've heard that there's this out there. We are a curious species. We have always been a curious species. That is one of the things that really, really, really makes us us, right? A beaver has built the same house. They build a house just like us, right? They build a wood house just like us, right? Really cool wood house, got a dam around it, right? Been building the same thing. For however long beavers been building dams, they have never adapted it. We have taken our house from a cave to an apartment to a mansion, right? We adapt our adaptations, and we do that because we're scientific and curious. We're constantly looking for something new. We're constantly trying something new. And because of this, you see that we're constantly in flux, and we're constantly moving. And we have been in flux since our inception. Even when we were still within Africa, at the earliest of our species, new evidence is showing that we didn't come from one group on its own, but several groups that were a constantly fluxing group of Homo erectus. We are constantly in flux, and we are constantly mixing and moving and talking and sharing and everything, okay? We know this in things like the fact that the bell beakers are in 3 different spaces in Europe, and they have the same culture in 3 different spaces in Europe, and they have different genetics in each space. They have nothing in common other than the culture, right? So we absolutely see that there is this constant flux and this constant movement. And in this constant flux and in this constant movement, if you see something new, you like it, you're like, ooh, that's pretty. Ooh, I like that. That's new. Ooh, hey, how's you? You know, this is how we work. This is how we've always worked. During this time, we're tattooing our bodies. We have tattooing tools that 32,000 years or 35,000 years ago in a cave in France, right? During this time, we're tattooing our bodies. During this time, we're all braiding our hair and braiding shell beads into our hair. The Venus of Willendorf, okay? This is going to be somebody who is absolutely got 3C to 4C hair, most likely, and doing, you know, French braids or doing cornrows kind of braids in their hair with shell beads within it. But this is in Austria. I get those confused, sorry. So you're actually going, not that I get them confused, but sometimes the words, okay? But you're going to see that there is this constant mix and that nobody's white. Nobody's white. Nobody's white. Nobody's what we think of as white, even close. And then the people in the places that we think of as white look like this person behind me. We are not looking at groups of people who are... We're not looking at groups of people who are primitive. We're looking at groups of people who are ecologically advanced and scientifically advanced. We've talked in here about the 31,000 year ago beautiful amputation of a foot in Borneo, right? We know that medical advancement is very high within many of these older indigenous groups, and these are indigenous groups, right? Within many of these older groups, they're moving in, they're becoming a part of this land, they're becoming indigenous to this land, they're learning the land, the medicine, the space, and everything within this space. Though it should be noted that Homo sapiens were in the British Isles in Northern Europe after Homo sapien was in Turtle Island, because Homo sapien is in Turtle Island at 33,000 years ago, and Homo erectus is in Turtle Island at 130,000 years ago. So we absolutely see these groups moving into these spaces and becoming indigenous, learning the space, learning the plant life, learning the animal life, learning the medicine within these spaces, and learning what the earth gives them within these spaces, right? And so within this indigeneity, within this space, you're definitely seeing medicine and science working its way to the it's medicine and science in and of itself to be investigating these things to figure out how they're going to work with the body as you're moving into spaces anyways, okay? So these things in and of themselves are medicine and science. And you absolutely see that there is extensive medicine and science in ways that we won't see again within Europe until about 1900. 1900, okay? So we see this throughout Europe. We see all of this medicine and science really throughout the world at this time. Absolutely, it is coast to coast, north to south, everywhere. Everybody has these abilities, right? A lot of times I get really frustrated with the ancient apocalypse thought process or the ancient aliens thought process that states that it took some advanced group of whatever to come in and teach Egyptians or Indonesians or Peruvians how to build pyramids. Catchphrasing it on the idea that these are all the same pyramid and none of those three pyramids look anything alike, and catchphrasing it on the idea that there's no record or idea of how these peoples could have done this except for the fact that the Egyptians wrote everything down. The Indonesians just had to cut some stones and haul them, and you can't tell me that that's not impossible. And the Peruvians did a lot of documentation as well, so I'm not sure why we have to have some advanced group come in and teach us how to do something we wrote down how we did from first to last. So we do see that science and medicine is extensive across the globe in these times. And then we start to get to the start of violence and the start of stratification. I've covered several different things. We are about half an hour in. I'm going to go ahead and open it up for a hot second. And then what we're going to talk about next is that start of stratification and that start of violence and that start of othering. But I want to open it up for any questions about how we came about with light skin, what it means, anything that we've just recently covered. And then we'll go into the next. Before I open it up, if you are new to my live, if you act like a racist ass, I will not only report you and block you, but I'll tell you off. And we don't do phobia based on gender and desire in my space at all. We also do kindness here. You know, kindness is really key to who we are as humans, and we've really lost a lot of it. So I'm going to ask it. I'm giving it. I will open it up only for a brief amount of time. I know that it can become very hard for other people when they're open because it can get very trolly. But I will try to answer some questions and go from there. Thank you, love you too. Yes, not an advantage except in the specific place it's in, right? But none of them are actually an advantage except in the specific place that they're in, right? When you take them, and that's why they're not an evolution. To be an evolution, it'd have to be an advantage everywhere. White skin is helpful in the fact that it allows for the intake of vitamin D. And there are some recent studies that state that they think that light skin might actually help warmth retention. But I haven't gotten enough. They've only done like one study. I don't got enough information to really give an in-depth. And that's very recent. But it really is the ability to get vitamin D from the lack of cloud cover or lack of sun in the heavy cloud cover environment that you're finding it coming out in northern latitudes. It happens that there's more diversity within our own populations because of the fact that, okay, so like as you're moving out, you're still taking most of the genes with you, right? We've talked a little bit before and we've kind of narrowed it down to only taking a few, right? But you really have to have that genetic diversity to continue to be able to populate, because we saw within the Neanderthals that lack of genetic diversity when the Erectus moved out with less genes gave that lack of ability to move on. And a lot of times when I'm talking about them, I'm kind of putting the two of them together. But as you're moving out as Homo sapien, because you're coming in and you're going back, you're coming in and you're going back, and you're never once just moving out and staying out, and there's always this constant gene flow still going on, you're maintaining a lot of that genetic diversity in all the populations that are leaving, because they're leaving with a greater amount of diversity within the genes anyways, and then they've always got new inflow of that genetic diversity, right? So if you've always got people that are going from sub-Saharan Africa up to Norway, and this is always fucking happening, then they're always taking this gene flow within them. So Cheddarman was not in the EU for very long. The EU wasn't out from underneath ice until roughly the time he was in there. So he wasn't in the EU at that time, you know, for very long. So not enough generational time frame. So Jamal, when I say multiple groups, am I saying African wasn't there first? No, what I'm saying is that it's now thought that when Homo sapiens speciated from Homo erectus, that there were multiple. So I'm going to explain it as a nation of Homo erectus that have multiple tribes within Homo erectus, and they would meet. And because they had like multiple tribes over a broader expanse, those meetings kept that gene flow through. So when Homo erectus or Homo sapiens speciates, it's almost just an evolution forward of Homo erectus, because it doesn't have any lack of genetic diversity that you see within Neanderthals and other ones. Thank you. Dark skin is demonized because, again, when Europeans invade Turtle Island and start to steal people from Africa, Europeans need to justify this because they're committing atrocities, and they can't justify it in any other way, right? They start to use the idea of race or specific spaces to mean that first they use religion. First, they decide it's the children of Ham, who is the son of Cain. First, they decide that it's the children of Ham. And so initially they use religion, and then after that they invent the theory of race to justify it instead, because they can no longer use religion because they've proven that God, they're starting to see evolution into play, and they're no longer looking at religion and God's creation. So they change the way they're looking at it. Subgroups of haplogroups absolutely indicate migration. So subgroups of haplogroups, like the X1 gene is here in Turtle Island and the X2 gene is in Siberia, right? So X1 is going to be that first, and then X2 is going to be the second. Okay, so there's a lot, and I'm going to go ahead, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it on to sub only, not so that they can ask questions so much as so that I can read back through these, because I'm going to go ahead and go through all of these. But that way it slows it down for me, so I don't have a lot of questions, and it makes it easier for me to go back through. So let me go ahead and scroll back up, and I'm just going to kind of answer them as I come in. Okay, so let me see. Let me try and make sure I get to the point. Okay. Lactose persistence does not spread through Europe faster than 100 generations. 100 generations is roughly 2,500 years within Homo sapiens. And so lactose starts developing with us, the lactose persistence, the ability to drink lactose as adults, starts developing within us after we start to use milk bearing animals to create cheeses and stuff like that. And it's the cheeses that we use first to get there. And Cheddar Man didn't have that. He was not able to tolerate milk. But what you see is that it takes at least 2,500 years for that to start. But we see that the start of husbandry of milk-bearing animals is about 10,000 years ago as well. And so you're absolutely going to see that by this time lactase persistence is actually spread through Europe. The reason that they were able to drink milk, or what it was they weren't drinking milk, they were eating cheese. And cheese is something that even if you have some lactose issues, sometimes you can tolerate, and so you'll develop better tolerance for that. The huge time difference in the evolutionary process, I'm not exactly sure with that. So I know I only do human evolution, and I really only do Homo species. I do know that hominins go back about 7 million years, and that we can see different leaps. Homo erectus was around for 2 million years, and they're who we came from. Neanderthal was around for about 600,000 years. We've been here for about 300,000 years. I don't see like huge time differences. I do see that evolution isn't linear though, and it doesn't go in a straight line, and like we're not a pinnacle. It'll go like several different ways and spider out in several different ways. And we talk in some of my other conversations about Naladi, which really shows how evolution isn't linear, because Naladi kind of spirals out in 3 different ways. Awesome, Adri. The person behind me is Cheddar Man. He is a 10,000-year-old find in Britain. The Melungians are not something that I actually really have a lot of information on. I think that I have heard about them, but I've heard about them like people talking about them having to do with something else. And so I can take a look really quick at it. Appellation. We were originally all dark, then migrated and adapted. We're talking currently about how the adaptation for light skin came about, how it is not an evolutionary advantage on any level, how we were all a lot darker until very recently, and we're going to be moving into some other things. But we're also talking about a subject that often comes up is what we've deemed in the United States as white culture very much, that kind of exploitative plastic. Very often you will see things like "why is white" as a comment on different things that are being done that we generally attribute to white people. So 100 generations is for any adaptation, so it's going to be any adaptation to any environmental need. Thank you, Rusty. Okay, I think I got the more diversity within. So the fold on the inner eye is actually in an extreme northern climate where you have a lot of snow, because what it does is so when sun hits the snow, it reflects back up into the eyes, and it can be very blinding. It's called snow blindness. Well, there's a couple different things that can be snow blinding, like sometimes you can get snow blinded in a blizzard, but really and it will actually it's like so bright, it's like sunlight bright, so at times it can be like looking at the sun, it can snow blind you, is what they call it, or one of the reasons they call it snow blind. So the fold on the inner portion of the eye actually helps protect that reflection of the snow, the sun off of the snow, so that you don't get sun blinded. You also see that in northern latitudes, in Arctic groups of people like the Sami, and within the many of the northern latitude Arctic people within Turtle Island. You will see that, and it's really about that reflection from the snow, because that reflection from the snow will snow blind you. So white skin isn't a deficiency, lack of vitamin D. White skin is it's an adaptation for living in a space where there isn't a lot of vitamin D from the sun. It's not that you're deficient and so your skin gets lighter. So I'm iron deficient. I have the gene for dark skin. It says I'm supposed to be dark skinned, but that just means that my genes didn't play out exactly right. Okay. That just means that one of my recessive genes became a little bit more dominant than was supposed to have been. It doesn't mean that I get iron infusions every 6 weeks. My skin isn't light because I have iron infusions, right? It's not like because I lack vitamin D. If I took more vitamin D, it wouldn't get darker. So white skin isn't a deficiency of vitamin D. It's to prevent deficiency of vitamin D when the vast majority of your vitamin D is coming from sun. Albino is a totally different thing. Albino is about missing something. And I was looking at it today and I can't remember the thing that it was missing, but there's something actually missing in the gene structure that removes the melanin from the body itself. I have done way too many things about Rh blood today and over the last week. Rh antigens. So when they type your blood, A, B, and O, they're not typing the blood itself. They're typing antigens along the surface of the blood. And there's the ABO antigens along the surface of the blood, and there's also the Rh antigens along the surface of the blood. And the Rh antigens, there's 49 of the Rh antigens, and one of them is capital D. And if a mother is missing capital D and she has a child with capital D, that first pregnancy will go just fine, but during that pregnancy, her body will develop antibodies for antigen D, and so the next pregnancy, her body will treat the baby that has antigen G like it's an infection, and it will toss antibodies at it. And so they have to take a shot that kind of helps regulate that and kind of gives them some antibody, like submerges and that part's way too much. Rh factor is not something I study. I only know all of this stuff because I get asked this a lot, and so I want to make sure it's clear. A lot of people want to say that it has to do with specific races. It does not have anything to do with race, and it actually, there are 3 different cultures in 3 different places across the globe currently that have 19%, which is the highest percent of any population to have the Rh negative factor. But there's one in Africa and one in Asia and one in Europe that are all 19% Rh negative. So it's really across the globe, and some people want to take it to species. We're all one species. We're all one species. We're all one species. All one species. All one species. All one species. We all have a little admixture from something else, but we are all one species. No one's purely Homo sapien. No one is something else. We are all one species. So many north indigenous Turtle Islanders are actually light-skinned. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest even before admixture, there is a lot of light skin. There's a lot with admixture now, but you also see this in older photographs and things like that. When you see Inuit and Yupik people being photographed early on, you absolutely see that there is a lot of lighter skin. When I'm talking about lighter, what I'm talking about is the same shade on a scale of shade that you're going to see in any other northern continent or northern area, but you're going to see a different undertone in a couple of different areas. This could be admixture, this could be adaptation for that specific area. So you might see a little bit of difference between light North Turtle Island and light North Asian, East Asian, and light North European, West European, but you're not going to see that it's really a whole lot. There's still like if you go to the makeup store and you get like a light shade of foundation, you're going to get like 3 different undertones for your shade of foundation, right? You're going to get a neutral, and you're going to get a warm, and you're going to get a cool. And it's those undertones that are the difference. But every culture has a 0-0 base of shade of foundation that is extremely light. I think that might be the best way that I can think of to explain it. I'm not a makeup person, so it did occur to me before now, but that just okay. And so I say multiple groups. Am I saying African people? I think I explained that. Homo erectus had multiple Homo erectus groups that were mixing and having that great genetic diversity, and they're mixing. And so it's thought now, or it's starting to be thought now, that we're just kind of like an evolution forward from Homo erectus, not like we're a speciation, because they had that great amount of genetic mixing as we were evolving from them. I do never deal with anything that has to do with Moses's fantasies. In fact, we don't talk about that in my group unless we're talking about my side of the story. No one said you can't ask about Melosian. Nobody said that. I don't know why. Anyways. Those that stay inside, and we actually see rickets happens quite a bit because of people staying inside to achieve light skin even. Dark skin is demonized because when Europeans decided to discover science again and appropriate it from different spaces, they decided to justify their atrocity with creation of race theory. I do not have a book yet. I am working on one though. Beautiful. A lot of times pain comes with cold. Like for me, because I have a lot of issues too, and a lot of times moving to a different environment that's really cold will cause it. But I don't really think it has anything to do with like genetics. Dark eyes. So we believe that dark eyes and dark skin both start with Homo erectus, but since we speciated in Africa, we're speciating for a high sun environment, and that speciation for a high sun environment, light eyes are an adaptation for low light. Dark eyes are an adaptation for high light. So speciating in a high light environment, we speciated with darker eyes. Yeah, beautiful. I think it's the climate that you're in, and it's just the fact that cold environments can be extremely painful. Forever it's better to be in a hot, dry environment, especially if you have medical problems usually. Awesome. Thank you guys. Let me see. Exposure to the sun does tan most skin tones, but what that is that what you're doing is you're burning the melanin in your skin, and so you're kind of causing it to kind of crisp up, right? Think of like kind of burning yourself in a toaster, right? And it causes it to kind of crisp up and get a little bit darker because it's reacting to the exposure to the sun that it's trying to prevent, right? So you're going to get that darker to the skin, but you're not going to see that. That's not going to translate so much like directly relationship to the next generation or anything. It's going to take still a few bits of generations. Okay, awesome. Okay, so what we're going to talk about next is going into when we start to see violence starting and in the fossil record. And then also what we're going to talk about is why and how that ends up translating down. Yes, black people. So the dark skin, the melanin content in the skin, beautiful, is it kind of prevents the. Think of like just a layer of sunscreen on that. Like it's kind of like just an extra layer of protection. It doesn't completely protect, right? You can be very dark and still sunburn, but it gives an extra layer of protection, right? It makes it to where your sunburn might not be as bad, or it might take more sun for you to burn, basically. So it's just our body's own sunscreen, basically. They do believe that we had something else that our skin would kind of like the layers of our skin earlier, they would kind of almost form a barrier on our skin too, like as they weren't exfoliated off. I don't really understand this concept or what they're saying, but there's like this layer that it kind of forms, and it would make us look older at the time, and it also would give us like an extra protection against the sun. So when we are looking at, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the comments again completely, just so that I can actually like not get distracted. Sorry, I'm just so easily distracted sometimes. I scroll way too easily. So I was talking to somebody this week, and I have talked a couple times in here about our early God Kings, but I've always like had something that I wanted to state with it. Like I always had this piece of the poem that I wanted to talk about, and I keep losing it. And now I seem to have lost it. I just had it. But I want to go over and marked it. And apparently I did not mark it well enough. I think I'm in the wrong book. There it is. Okay. So I have a couple of books and I did a couple of study. But first I want to talk about the fact that we really don't start seeing violence in the fossil record until 10,000 years ago. I knew it before in Saqqara in Egypt. Saqqara in Egypt. The earliest cemeteries we see before the first dynasty, pre-first dynasty, that we have one burial that is two skeletons that have 21 points between them. And before this was the first violence that I had known of that is actual evidence of violence. We do have a point lodged in somebody's thigh at about 20 to 30,000 years ago. The point lodged in somebody's thigh at about 20 to 30,000 years ago isn't necessarily an evidence of homo-on-homo violence. What it could be is, a hunting accident. It could be it slipped while you were flint napping. It could be many things. It could absolutely be violence, right? But it's not like direct, absolute evidence of violence. So it's not until Saqqara, and then recently somebody had pointed out to me a massacre in Kenya that's about 10,000 years old. And so this is our first evidences that we are really seeing in the fossil record that I know of today. Now, I often try and make sure I double down on the knowledge that this is what I know today. It could change tomorrow. There could be things that I haven't seen yet that might even change everything I'm saying. This is what I know today, and I'm teaching you what I know today. One thing about science, archaeology, anthropology, all of these things, they are changing completely fast. This is why people are like, what books do you recommend? None. Read an article, because your articles are coming out 2 to 3 new finds massively a year, sometimes every month, So books, by the time you publish, are outdated. We've got new facts in. And so absolutely, this is what I have for now. It could, if you have different information, tell me, because I want to know. So the 10,000-year-old find, what we see is what looks like the slaughter of a group. We do not see any teenagers. We see, I think, maybe a couple small children, women, men. One woman was apparently tied up in almost a fetal position and was pregnant when she died, but we don't see like any in-between ages, so it's assumed by this that they might have been taken. With this, what this looks like, they've decided it's hunter-gatherers. I don't think this is hunter-gatherers, and the reason that I don't think this is hunter-gatherers is because it looks like land, right? You're trying to take over a group's area of land, right? If you're taking out a whole group, why are you taking out a whole group? The first times that we really start to see taking out of whole group is after we start to see the thought process that land is owned. We start to see the thought process that land is owned when we start to see early breeding of animals and early grain husbandry. Husbandry meaning the kind of guiding of something to grow through breeding, like a good ram to a good ewe, right? Or choosing different wheat or barley plants, the better of the plants to seed to let grow, and taking the lesser and making sure that they don't grow, right? And so this is husbandry. Our early husbandries of wheat, taking wheat from just a wild plant to something that you might cultivate, and still cultivating within a field that you are actually haven't removed from its original place. And our first herding of animal husbandry, one of them is in Kenya and one of them is in Europe, right? So we actually see that we see lactose tolerance in people in West Africa. Geographically challenged. And I might have just related Kenya to West Africa, and Kenya is not in West Africa, so give me about a hot second while I double check my check. But we do see that in West Africa, we see our first advent of husbandry of wheat and husbandry of animals. East Africa. Aha, see, I was wrong. So we do see this is in East Africa, but yeah, okay. And actually it is in West Africa that we do see that first husbandry of animals. Okay, so but we do see around this time in spaces this idea of this is my crop, this is my space, this is my place, right? And we also see that this is on a riverbed, not bed, but like a shore. So it could very well be that we're looking at an early settled group, that another group is coming in and taking over space, right? It could also be that, they wanted their territory of their hunter-gatherer roots, right? Because hunting and gathering doesn't mean that you're just constantly wandering. You're probably returning, well, many people will actually have houses built that they return to every year during specific seasons. You might have your spring, your summer, your winter, your fall house, and in the areas where you're gathering goods. Sometimes it will be, a space within a mile road of each other, and, you might do, year one here, year two here, year three here, right? So hunter-gathering does not mean that you're not returning to the same space year after year. It does not mean that you are migrating constantly into a new space. You are often returning to home, but home is with you, and it's here, right? Because it's all your home in this space, right? So this very well could be that. We start to see, though, the first start of agricultural cities around the same time. So we start to see that violence within the archaeological records in those two spaces, Saqqara in Egypt and the space in Kenya and East Africa. But where we're seeing up in Mesopotamia and at the same time, along a river in Jordan, we see the first agricultural city. Now, I believe that agriculture has probably been along the Nile River forever, and I believe that the Nile River is probably the only place to grow non-native plants, that it's healthy to grow non-native plants. In first agricultural thought processes, we know that what happened was not rows and fields. It was, I have a meadow, and I know that there's a lot of wheat in the meadow, so I'm going to just keep that meadow because I know wheat grows in that meadow. But what I'm going to do is when I'm harvesting the wheat, certain stalks of wheat are going to have bigger seeds on them. So I'm going to plant the stalks of wheat that have the bigger seeds on it and take the other stalks, so that the smaller seeds of wheat aren't in next year's crop. Next year's crop is going to have larger seeds of wheat. And this is how you see wheat start to grow into what we know of as wheat today. But this is done in like a meadow. It's done where the wheat's already at. It's not transplanting the wheat and taking the wheat into somewhere else. It's not tilling up the soil and strewing lines right? It's not bringing water in from somewhere else. This has already got water access because this meadow is already growing wheat. So when you're starting to see your first movement of these crops out of their natural habitat into a non-indigenous habitat, the Nile is absolutely an ideal place. But we really don't start to see that until a little bit later that we know of within the archaeological record. That does not mean it wasn't happening. It could have absolutely been happening, and cities were not built around it. And because of the way the Nile works, you can absolutely see that it's going to wash away a lot of evidence year after year because of the flooding of the Nile year after year. So it makes sense that you start to do this within the Nile River and along the Nile, and then seeing that this works, you decide to go and do it along another river. But instead of understanding that the reason it works along the Nile is because those yearly floods replenish the earth every year, so all the nutrients the wheat's robbing from the soil are put back in within the yearly flood. The River Jordan isn't flooding every year, so it's not giving these Great Plains where you're getting that replenishment, right? So what you see, the city is called Ain Ghazal, Ainghazal. What you see is they take this river in Jordan that's very fertile and lush. They strip the land, and they start this city that's agricultural. And this agricultural city that they start is gone in 300 years because they have turned this space into a desert wasteland. I have it here somewhere, and I'm trying to see if I don't think I have it marked, unfortunately. Okay, so I don't have what I'm looking for on this one. With this, though, what we see is that this early start of agriculture shows very early on that it doesn't work. It is killing the land. It is causing problem. But what you see is your early start of kings. And in this early start of kings, you see this early start of structure of society as somebody being dominant and having control over the products of the society. We see this translate down next into the early cities along Mesopotamia and Ur. And when we see this translating down, we start to see god kings coming into effect. And this is when we start to see our first othering. And this is when we start to see our first evidence really booming in the archaeological record and really booming in the records, even in the drawings and the writings and different things within cultures, right? We start to see violence really start to take place when we start to see this othering come in. We start to see this othering come in really when we start to see the God King Advent. And what I'm going to read to you is, trying to see if it has the lines or what. This is the birth of the legend of Sargon. It's the earliest text of it. It's found on an 8th century Assyrian tablet. And it is volume 2, 819. I am Sargon, the great king, king of Akkad. My mother was high priestess. I did not know my father. My father's brothers dwell in the uplands. My city is Azarpuruni, which lies on the Euphrates bank. My mother, the high priestess, conceived me. She bore me in secret. She placed me in a reed basket. She sealed my hatch with pitch. She left me to the river, whence I could not come up. The river carried me off. It brought me to Akkad, Aki, drawer of water. Aki, drawer of water, brought me up as he dipped up his bucket. Aki, drawer of water, raised me as his adopted son. Aki, drawer of water, set me to his orchard work. During my orchard work, Ishtar loved me. Sargon is in 2300 BCE, so we're looking at 4,000 years ago. And what we're looking with this is the start of this God-King concept. Where is it in here? Because I know it goes further. We see that he gets this idea that he rules through a divine right. And when you see this, what you start to see is this idea that this dominion has to do with divinity. And when he is given this dominion, you see this start of layers within society. these layers within society, and you see this earlier within Egypt because, again, he's at 2300 BCE. We absolutely see Egypt as being way earlier than that. We're looking at least 3000 BCE, but the pre-things are going back further than that, right? Our earliest hieroglyphics, Scorpion King, is at about 3500, maybe 4000 BCE. So while this is what we call our first writing, it's because we're ignoring hieroglyphs. We're not even talking hieroglyphs into the situation because, again, Western thought, right? Western thought, deciding that only Western thought has anything to do with it. Now, as you're reading through all of these legends, you absolutely see these legends translate down to Moses. You absolutely see these legends translate down to all of these other gods in this divine kingdom, divine kingship. When we're looking at these things, we start to see this. It's not me that's suppressing you. It's not me that's keeping you down. It's not me that's the problem. It's the people in the hills. It's those barbarians out there. And what we start to see is this documentation within all of the ancient pictures and wall art that we see. We start to see the, people that we've captured are these barbarians from the hills. The people that are the problem are these people who don't have civilization. My book is falling apart as I'm moving pages. I'm trying to find the Akkadian. There is. And in this look of, it is the people in the hills, it is the barbarians in the hills who are the problem, you start to see the event of othering. And you absolutely start to see that this event of othering has to do with the idea that I don't want you to fight me, I want you to fight someone else. This idea that I don't want you to fight me, I want you to fight somebody else, really doesn't translate into anything else until you start to see multiple cities starting to develop, right? Once you see multiple cities starting to develop, you start to see this concept of, it's not the barbarians in the hills now, it's the other nation state, right? And then when you see religion start to develop, you see this translate down to sin. We're God's chosen, these other people are no longer God's chosen. This is where you start to get this concept of special. This is where you start to get this concept that certain groups are supreme over other groups, right? This idea that it's okay to exploit different groups, that it's okay to be exploitable, to be the workers in the field who are being beaten up, right? The idea that it is okay to do these things, the idea that it is okay to distance yourself from community and others, right? So when you see this start of us distancing ourselves, when you see this start of levels within society, right, is when you start to see this rise of violence across the globe. Now, we see this stay pretty much in this specific area along the Levant, these ideas for a hot second down into Egypt. But then you start to see this translating out. And when you start to see this translating out, really comes at maybe 1000 BCE, right? You're not seeing this widespread going further out until a little bit later on. Now, as we're looking in this area, what we're looking at is people who start to develop things like writing. You see the Egyptians developing writing in their hieroglyphs. You see cuneiform starting to develop. You start to see the idea of forced labor really starting to come into play. The idea of having groups of people that well, first of all, nobody possessed land beforehand. Now everybody possesses land. Nobody possessed animals beforehand. Now everybody possesses animals. Before these things were other beings, now they're no longer other beings. And so when you can start to dehumanize the land and dehumanize the animals, you can start to dehumanize other human beings, right? Because you have made the land and the animals inanimate. You have given them a lack of autonomy over themselves. And as you're making the lack of autonomy prevalent within land and within the animals, you allow this lack of autonomy to translate over into other human beings. So with this rise of violence and war, we also start to see this rise of forced servitude, right? At this point, it is what we call slavery, but it is not what we call chattel slavery. It is an entirely different form of slavery, just so you're aware. So we start to see this moving forward. We start to see these cities rise and fall. You see these cycles of these kings rising and falling, and then we start to see a couple things really solidify down to get to where we're at today. And what you start to see really solidify down, and let me remind you that nobody in this space at this time is light of skin. Nobody in this space at this time is light of skin. Nobody in this space at this time now, nobody in that space at this time now is what we would call white anyways, okay? But nobody in this space is light of skin. What we are seeing is darker skinned groups, so we're not seeing this as a skin ideology, right? But what we are seeing is this ideology of the mountains versus us, the barbarians versus us, the sinful nation versus us. This really irons down after a couple of things happen. First, you see that Egypt is going really good. Egypt has, both kings and queens. We find that we have like 17 queens throughout Egypt's history. We just found another one, right, who was before half of the kings, so a really early queen. And we see that our oldest author is a female. She's actually Sargon's daughter. I had her name like right at the tip of my fingers right here just a hot second ago. It's in this one because I was asked this the other night. So let me go ahead and actually give that one. Enhudwana is the name of the first priestess of Sargon. And she is actually our first author. Like, she wrote and she actually has like documents that she signed that are like, I don't think they're poetic, but I think they're like ballad, like not songs, but like tales. And so we see even within Mesopotamia that there is not an idea that it is male or female that is divine. It's not an idea that is male or female that rules, right? So we're not even seeing this divided gender yet. When we start to get to Egypt being conquered by outsiders, you see that Egypt gets conquered by the Canaanites. And then you see that the Canaanites are thrown out of Egypt. And then you see that there's a group of Canaanites that remains within Egypt. You see that for the last 1000 to 1600 BCE, that Egypt is actually ruled by foreign dynasties. So first we see that it is the Canaanites, then we see it as the Sumerians. There's another group in that area that comes in, and then finally it comes in and the Greeks come through. Alexander the Great comes through. He decides to conquer everything. He leaves Alexandrias everywhere. Everywhere there's an Alexandria, Alexander the Great had conquered. And when he does, he leaves behind as he dies, he leaves behind his generals. All his generals get the cities that he conquered and the regions that he conquered, and Ptolemy gets Egypt. And so the last dynasty in Egypt of pharaohs is actually Greek, right? But during this time, we also see that the Israelites are becoming their own people. You see the Israelites who were Canaanites returning to Canaan, and you see a lot of battles and a lot of fighting and a lot of crappy shit. I'm very pro-Israelite. That does not mean negative things about the Israelites. Everybody is killing each other at this time. But you absolutely see the Israelites going through and doing this. And you also see that you have Europe really starting to settle during this time, right? You're not seeing big city-states like you're seeing in these spaces, but what you are seeing is large nations. You have the Germanic nation, you have the Keltoi nations, you have the Latin nation, you have, the root Finno-Ugric people who will eventually become the Sami and the Finn and a few other of those spaces up in the northern area. And these people are starting to really coalesce as peoples within these areas. We already have, like people in Ireland. We already have people in Scandinavia. These people are really settled in these spaces. These big city-states are still really only within the Middle East, right? In the Levant and Egypt and Greece, like around the Mediterranean, right? Not the Middle East, but the Near East, around the Mediterranean, the Levant, Egypt. These huge city-states are still really only here. This does not mean that there are not great civilizations, right? It just means that this idea of building in stone, taking over and making your mark, right? Being here forever instead of just being a part of the cycle, coming and going, right? We see that this really starts to happen really when we start to see Greece, okay? This is when we start to see it spreading. Now, before this, what we see is that these groups are here. They're creating these spaces. They're fucking shit up, right? There's some problems. They're all fighting each other, but it's not really spreading out of this area. And these thought processes are very focused onto here. When we see the Greeks really start to double down in their thought processes and start to coalesce, we also see with the Greeks that they become this very first toxic patriarchy. We have patriarchy before that. We have matriarchy before that. These are not toxic environments. Matriarchy and patriarchy doesn't place one biological sex above the other. It doesn't matter what your biological sex is. It doesn't matter what your gender is. Many matriarchies and patriarchies have multiple genders. None of these things matter. What matters is instead what you do, what's good for you, how you fit, and what matriarchy and patriarchy is tracing lines of humanity. It is not about who's better, right? It's about whether or not we trace our kingship through our maternal line or our paternal line. Is our king, is the child that will inherit from our king his child or his sister's child, right? That's what we're seeing. If it's a patriarchal line, the king's son will inherit. If it's a matriarchal line, the king's sister's son will inherit, because the king and his sister both come from the same mother, her line, and you know that the sister is continuing that line, whereas any child that the king may think he has, he can't guarantee is his, right? So we don't see toxic matriarchy and patriarchy really starting until we see the ancient Greeks. And what we see with the ancient Greeks is we see people who are really trying to justify their actions, right? We see kind of a conquering nation that goes out and does a lot of destruction. We also see that they had a hatred of women. This is pretty much across the board. There is this thought process that women are just broken men. There is no equality for women. And we see that they were absolutely into young men over women. And so they would have their women dress as young men instead so that they could be intimate with them, because they would rather have teenage boys than adult women. This was a really Greek problem. It is known as the Greek problem. So we see that this is how the Greeks kind of bring forward their ideas that they are dominant and in control of this space, and that it is academia and it is male thought process that is this pinnacle, okay? When we start to see this idea that there is this pinnacle, right, is when we start to see all of this previous exploitation, all of this previous understanding of all this previous understanding of ownership of land starting to come into play, really start to double down, because what we see is that the Greeks take ownership of land into rule, right? If you own land, then you are a voting member of parliament. If you own land, then you have the right to vote. You are a citizen if you own land. Women cannot vote. Slaves cannot vote. You have to own land to be a voter. So we absolutely see this ownership, this ability to own, is that double down of what it is that makes you worthy, right? Whether or not you have exploited and owned other things is what makes you worthy, right? So when we see the Romans adapt this and take it, and we start to see this idea that we've taken agriculture that should have never gone anywhere but the Nile, if anywhere, out of its original state. And we have forced land to morph to it in ways that have been very destructive. We have decided that ownership of land, that, well, first we've decided that if you're a barbarian, if you're in the hills, if you're in a different city state, they're your other, there's something wrong with you, you're not as good as we are. And now we've decided that if you own land, that you are better than everybody else within your society as well. So not only are we better than everybody in the hills, and we're better than everybody in this other city, but we're better than everybody within our own city. And now we're also better than the women, and we're better than the slaves, right? So we have this double down of chosen. We're chosen, right? We've already started our stratification. This is where our stratification really starts to double it down, right? Because now ownership of land is passing through family lines. It's not like you can just get money and buy it, right? You have to own it, right? And so we see that it becomes this new form of elite, right? But this start of elite starts with our God kings. This start of elite starts with stratification, okay? Now we see this translating into the idea of the ability to exploit others, the idea that this is just kind of ours to have. But when we really see that just really double down is when we see Rome has appropriated. Now first, Rome went through and eradicated the Greeks. Rome went through and eradicated the other Latins. Rome went through and eradicated the Keltoi, or, did their best with all of these. Not everybody was eradicated, right? But Rome went through and tried to eradicate all these cultures. And when Rome is going through to try and eradicate all these cultures, they go through and they try and eradicate this little culture over in Canaan that has been struggling for a few thousand years at this point. And what they do is, in their conquering of Jerusalem, they put in place a puppet king, and this man comes who is supposed to be a king, right? Who is literally supposed to help worship or help them pull out of this space. But is instead absolutely trying to get his people to see that they should fight, right? Absolutely trying to get his people to see that this is not okay. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, right? There is this idea of an oppressed people who is struggling out of their oppression, right? An oppressed people who is not only struggling out of their oppression, but you're seeing that this man is like, listen, under this oppression that's been going on for a couple hundred years, you've lost your way. And we really need to get back to the way our God told us, because God chose us. God said that we were his chosen, right? He gave us this thought process that we were chosen and we're his chosen, and he gave us this land. So we really need to get back to this thought process that we're chosen so that we can throw off these Roman people, because the fact that we fucked up and the fact that we're sinning is why God won't overthrow these people. Go back to David, right? David couldn't inherit, David's kingdom couldn't be perfect because David had sinned. So it was left to his child's kingdom to be perfect, right? Because of Bathsheba, because of the woman in the bath on the tub, or the tub on the ceiling, right? Not ceiling, the rooftop, right? So you absolutely see that Jesus is trying to bring people back to the true way of the faith and trying to overthrow the oppressor. And this gets overthrown and he gets killed. And it gets translated for a while as just people within the Judaic faith who are really trying to see forward. And then you see it kind of expand out. But then you see Constantine is an emperor among three emperors, and he's tired of being an emperor among three emperors. And so he decides to take over this monotheistic faith. Okay? Because if he can take this monotheistic faith and make it a Christian faith, or make it a national faith, if he can make it a national faith, then he can justify being a mono emperor, right? Like, they've got multiple gods, so having three emperors is right. If you've only got one god, having one emperor is right, right? This is a direct communication to that singular god. So you see Constantine take this man's faith, who he was trying to save his people from being eradicated, Constantine appropriates it, twists it, and in turn uses it to give dominion. And you see that Christianity at this time frame becomes, we are God's chosen. This was our gift to destroy. And this is where you see the concept of chosen by God, the earth is here to destroy, take, start. As you see that move down, you absolutely see it move down in several different ways. You see it move down into race later on. But at this time, what you are not seeing is race. What you are seeing again is God's chosen versus the rest of the world. Again, we've gone from, I'm protecting you from the barbarians in the hill, we're so good civilized here in this city, to my nation state is better than your nation state, we're more civilized to you, to we are God's children and you are not God's children, so now we can kill you. This is where we get these concepts that it is within our right to exploit. This is the start of what we often think of as the culture that we're talking about when we're like, why is white? This is that start of the idea that it is okay to exploit the earth, the animals, and everything else around us. I'm going to open it up for a little bit and answer any questions that come across. And then again, what I'll probably do is close it down to subs only so I can read the questions. I'm only going to open up for a short period of time and then I'll shut it down again. I'm going to try and explain how this translates into present day after that. Hopefully some of it will help, but I'm going to try and explain to how this translates down into the culture that we're dealing with today. Again, my space, I do not tolerate racism and I do not tolerate phobia based on gender and desire. I have no desire to deal with any of that. It will be a report and a block. And I ask for kindness because it is what I'm giving, and kindness is key to humanity. If you want any of that clarified into something else, or have any questions based on that. I am an anthropologist. I have a degree in anthropology with a focus in paleoanthropology and within archaeology, pre-Christian Europe. A bubbly soda. There's no chosen. We have people who like to believe that they're chosen, but there's no chosen. Manifest destiny is where we're taking it. I can talk a little bit more about the Greek problem. I do have a YouTube. It's in Widow Ord, just like this channel. I do not know about Jacob and SUI. That's not my forte. I'm not a biblical scholar, and I'm not a Christian. I'm actually pretty anti-Christianity, so I really don't know a whole lot about it. I mean, I've read the Bible probably more than most people have, but like I don't remember skin color, and I would say that they're all probably dark skin at that time, because like we were saying just a little bit ago, dark skin is actually pretty prevalent throughout all everywhere until pretty recently, very recently, within the last 5,000 years at the very latest, depending on where you're at. Do Russians get thrown on the white bus? So, I'll talk about that. Hold on a second. You can be out of here. I don't know why you're out of here, but have fun. Our Adrib, there's a link tree in my bio that has linked to articles of all the things that I discuss, but they're all like scientific journal articles, and they'll give you good ideas of good scientific journal articles to find and give you a sense of a start. It does all boil down to read.
I am not sure what the best anthro program in the USA is right now. I can absolutely explain more about my name. Okay, so let me give it just a minute. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it on to subs, and then I'm going to go ahead and just read through some of them and try and answer them as they come up, just because it'll be a little bit easier. Thank you, thank you. The druids always come up a little bit. Oh shit, that's not what I wanted to do. That's what I wanted to do. Sorry. Okay, so I'm just going to put on subs only just so I can read back through it. It makes it easier for me. We are going to talk about Manifest Destiny a little bit, but I don't want to touch on it quite yet, but I will get to it, I promise. And again, my credentials are, I've got degrees in archaeology and medicine. So the Greek problem with the hatred towards women really boils down to the fact that they have more attraction to young men than they did to women. They were more pedophilic than anything else, which is a level of control, right? And what they would do is they would mentor young boys, and their mentorship would involve intimacy. And because they would rather mentor their young boys than they would be intimate with their wives, they create this idea that women are somehow the problem, somehow faulty. They also create this idea that we're broken men. We've touched in here a little bit before about how the vibrator was created. And it's really important because when we look at both the ancient Greeks and the Europeans in the 1800s, what we're looking at is groups of people who are looking for confirmation bias to confirm what they believe. And what they believe is that they're better than everybody else. And so when you get to their medicine, we see things like the idea that women are broken men, that we bleed because we've broken, and that anytime we have any feelings outside of placid and, you know, meek and mild, or what is we should as cattle have, because we're cattle, it's because our womb has left its seat, and the womb wanders throughout the body. And when the womb has wandered throughout the body, you have to draw the womb back. And you can do this in a variety of different ways, like lighting incense underneath the vagina and having the incense draw the womb back. You can let blood, you can do smelling salts to draw the womb. Maybe it's gone to the leg and you have to draw it up. And when I mean wandering, what I mean is it's in your hand today and it's in your foot tomorrow wandering. This is what they thought. I'm not sure how they thought that happened while we were pregnant. Oh, there went my hand, right? But anyway, so to draw it back to its proper seat in the 1800s, what they decided was that they should do what's called an approximation, which is actually an orgasm. And the idea was that an orgasm drew the womb back to its proper seat, which is made it easier to get pregnant. It was actually like early on they thought that that's why people were infertile, was because, you know, like their womb must have wandered, so that's a reason to draw it back as well. But in the need to draw it back, or that's not how. So early on in this thought process, they actually started to tell men that they should actually give their wives orgasms during sex, because it was started to be believed that with the womb wandering and the orgasm or approximation, drawing it back to its proper seat, having that approximation happen meant that when you inseminated her, you would actually inseminate the womb where it was supposed to be, right? Instead of wandering throughout your body. So they also believed that this had to do with any time a woman had any thought processes other than he, right? And so because of this, doctors started manipulating women's genitals until they reached an approximation as a doctor's appointment. And so you'd go into the doctor and you lay down on a bed and he'd manipulate your genitals until you reached an approximation. So he'd masturbate you until you orgasmed. Now, everybody loves an orgasm. We all love an orgasm. So women are lining up down the street, appointments every day, hundreds and hundreds of women literally lined up around the street. They've done documentaries on this. They've done movies on this. I mean, it was just crazy. So men were getting tendinitis. Doctors were getting tendinitis because every day, just all day long masturbating women into orgasm, right? And so because of this, they invented the vibrator. So this is how we invented the vibrator, because we thought that we had to have orgasms in women to bring the womb back to its proper seat. So the Greeks thought process that the womb migrates throughout the body, and that's where hysteria comes from, is how we invented the vibrator in the 1850s, right? So we take this all the way back to the Greeks when we start to find science again. And the Greeks' problem is that instead of really truly looking at the body and really truly looking at men and women as equals, Greeks are doing everything to double down on this idea that male landowners are the pinnacle of society. And if you are a male landowner, the only thing you can do to be better than that is to be educated. And you can only be educated if you are a man, right? And so the idea that this is the pinnacle, the masculine is the pinnacle, is where that toxic patriarchy really comes in, and is really what the Greek problem is their refusal to look at anything through open eyes. Everything has that confirmation bias of they are the best, which we see repeated frequently in early United States. I do have a YouTube in What a Orb, same as this. Okay, I already answered that one. Awesome, Ariana. How did the dominion that we see play out in other civilizations? So we don't see this idea of this singular rulership through domination, rulership through control, really play out anywhere else until we start to see this stuff coming in. We don't see it play out until it's influenced. We never see it really play out in the vast majority of the Turtle Islands. Now, we do see it play out in some places in the Turtle Islands. Nothing is monolithic, right? We never see it play out until much, much later within the vast majority of spaces within Africa. Not really until we see Islam coming through. We don't really see, with the exception of Egypt, and even then Egypt, even with the god kings and this stratification within Egypt, we see this connection to the earth. So as long as we maintain this connection to the earth, as long as we have an earth god or goddess that we need this connection to, we see less exploitation. Once we get to the point that we believe that we're given dominion over the earth itself is when we see that really start to play out. But the idea that we're given dominion over the earth only comes in one space. It only comes from Christianity. Christianity is the only space that believes in dominion over the earth. Even ancient Judaism, even Judaism isn't a dominion. Even Judaism is animistic. Even Judaism believes in the earth as a part of themselves and doesn't think that God gave them the earth to kill and exploit. Now, I don't know exactly what Judaism believes about the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. I would tell you, though, that the translations of the Torah into the Old Testament are not accurate. And to find accurate anything on the Torah, you need to be able to read it in Hebrew. Or I believe Aramaic is the other one it's written in. But I could be wrong. I'm pretty sure it's Aramaic because I was in an Islamic camp as a child, for a school for about a year and learned Hebrew and Aramaic. I do not remember them, but I learned them from learning how to read the Torah and also from learning how to read the Quran. So you absolutely see that this idea of a singular God, or not a singular God, the idea of exploitation and dominion doesn't come in until later. And you don't see the idea of dominion develop separately, right? Like, it's not like you see a pyramid structure in Peru and a pyramid structure in Egypt and a pyramid structure in Indonesia, and they're all three different pyramid structures. It's big man over here, king over there, but still part of the earth. All animistic here, still part of the earth. God's over here, but still animistic and part of the earth. Dominion, and dominion spreads out from this central hub. But dominion, the idea of control over the earth, a gift that we can exploit, a gift that we can destroy, something given to us, only comes from one place that I have found. So, there are indigenous spaces across the globe. The question is, do Russians get thrown on the white bus? There are indigenous spaces across the globe. Skin color is nothing. Skin color currently, unfortunately, dictates in a lot of spaces how society treats you and the shit that's happening around you. But many people have heard the phrase, not all skin folk are kinfolk. And the fact of the matter is it doesn't matter what skin color you have. You can be an extremely exploitative, capitalistic person, and you can be supportive of white supremacy thought processes and ideals. We're seeing it in the media constantly right now, okay? So it really doesn't matter what color your skin is. White is more of a concept of construct that a vast group is currently kind of upholding. In other countries, you're going to see in spaces like Russia and the Ukraine. The Ukrainian people are an indigenous group that have been there longer than vast majorities of anybody else on the fucking planet, who were taken over and colonized, who threw off their colonizers, who have new colonizers coming, or have those same colonizers coming back and trying to recolonize, right? Ukrainians are absolutely people of light skin who are absolutely not on the white bus. They're an indigenous group of people fighting colonization, right? Within Russia, there are several indigenous groups still within Russia, right? The word shaman is a word that the Russians appropriated from the Tangun people, and I probably said that wrong, when they conquered them in the 1600s and then transliterated the word shaman from that group of people to what the Turtle Island indigenous people were doing. Right? So there are still indigenous groups within Russia that are still fighting, just like the Khmer Welsh are still fighting, Sami are still fighting. There are still indigenous groups who look like this, right? I am indigenous, right? Like, I'm not white. You see me as white. I'm white assumed, but I am actually indigenous, right? And so, like, there are still people whose skin is this shade who are not white. White becomes this cultural idea of the use of privilege that the skin tone gains you, and the support of that privilege that the skin tone gains you, right? And it also is about a disconnect from your heritage and a disconnect from any deeper idea of who you are and who we are as a globe. And it is also about this thought process that everything is here for the taking, right? So when people talk about things like mighty white, that's what they're talking about, right? When people say, there's no white culture, what they mean is that you're not white in your heritage. White is a skin color, right? There's not really a culture of it. Though I personally disagree. I do think there is white culture. I don't believe it has anything to do with your skin color, but I do believe that it is an exploitative plastic culture. And I do believe that it roots in what we're talking about, this idea that you have dominion and that you can exploit. So, whether or not Russians get thrown underneath the bus or thrown on the white bus has to do with who the Russians are. Are you a person who's indigenous in Russia who's fighting against colonization? Nope, you're not white. If you're a person within Russia who is fighting for colonization, mighty white. We can't read more, but I have a YouTube and I upload some of my lives. Thank you, cats. Manifest destiny. Okay, let's go ahead. Manifest destiny is the idea that God gave white people Turtle Island. And that because God gave white people this supremacy and gave them Turtle Island, they could eradicate every culture that they came across on Turtle Island. It is the idea that the land within Turtle Island was a God-given right to Europeans because Europeans are a pinnacle group, right? And it is the idea that led to the genocides of Turtle Islanders, right? It is this idea that God's manifest destiny for the European is to conquer the globe. It is the idea that if you are God's chosen, one of his children, which you can accomplish as long as you submit to him, right? To the Christian God, because, Christian God and Muslim God, you need to be, submissive to and worship them, to be one of their children. But the actual God of Abraham does not allow you in unless you are a part, right? Like, you're only his chosen if you're born to his chosen. So I'm not quite sure where you get the idea that you can follow God as a Christian or God as a Muslim. And again, no hate to Muslims. I'm actually not anti-Islam. I'm not anti-Judaism. I'm pretty anti-Christian. No hate to Muslims because there's a lot more love in the Quran. But the idea that you're chosen by a God that didn't choose you, he chose the Jews, is really fucked up, right? Like, you took his God and decided that you're now his chosen, even though only they were his chosen, right? So anyways, this idea of being chosen by God and being God's chosen gift to this planet, and the planet being God's gift to you, is that manifest destiny, that all of this is here for you to take, that all of this is here for you to eat like a locust, like a plague across the planet. That is God manifesting your destiny. Your destiny is what God has given you. God has given you this earth to control. And not just to control, but to subdued, to have dominion over, to pave, to cut down, to dig into, to subdue, to turn it not from a wild garden, but to the idea that God wants you to live in this city, in this temple that he, so it's not just that it's given to you by God, but it's given to you by God to control and subdue. And manifest destiny is that Christians have the right because God gave it to them. Any sense of the America's parallel path? We've talked about this in here a lot. And really, we talked about it, just touched a little bit on the start with, when we started with the theory of race and how the theory of race is debunked and how the theory of race really starts up, which we're also going to start up again on in just a second. But I will touch on it a little bit. I want to touch on it with that. So I will get to the parallel path. I'm assuming you mean by that by Turtle Island Indigenous. It does all boil down to greed and exploitation. So greed comes from the idea that you can accumulate more than you need. Greed comes from the idea that it's here to exploit, right? So if you don't believe that you can accumulate more than you need, if you believe that you should leave it for everybody else to be able to get what they need to, then you're not exploiting, right? So once you start believing that you can exploit it and take more is when you start getting to that greedy point, because now you have created a shortage that wasn't there before, and so the next person needs some and can't, so they start starving, so they might start getting greedy from that just because now they're trying to store because they needed it, right, and they didn't have it. But also you're getting more and more greedy because the more you have, the more you need. The more you have, the more you need. It's never enough, because that's just kind of how greed works, right? You start to get that fear that you don't ever have enough, right? My name, Enwida Ord. A is N in Swedish. If you're talking about specific words, et is the other one, but N usually applies to living things. Ord means word. It can also mean letter, stave, but it is book, but it is that base. So it says a Witta's word. Witta is the oldest etymology of the word witch. The Druids had a female half, and not necessarily that they were all female, but it was the study of the feminine. So the word wid means knowledge, and the word da means feminine, together widda. The word wid means knowledge again, so you see that in the last half of Druid, and the word dru means oak. So druid is oak knowledge, and widda is knowledge of the feminine. Knowledge of the mystique compared to knowledge of the earth, right? And so the Druid and the Widda are the ancient Celtic educated class. They are the scientists, they are the teachers, they are the doctors, they are the lawyers, lawgivers, right? And they also are the priests, but the priests are a small part of who they are. They are the keepers of the histories. And the Widda and the Druid, they had writing. Celtic writing is called Ogham. This is Irish Gaelic translated into, or this is speak out. Step up's on my ankle. Speak out translated into Irish Gaelic translated into Ogham. And they had writing. They didn't use writing. They believed that the use of writing decreased memory, which we are actually proving today with the fact that the use of Google is decreasing our memory capacity, because if we have it at our fingertips, we don't need to memorize it. So the Druids taught everything through memory, and the way they taught through memory actually held things a lot better than any writing ever has. And they were pretty scientifically advanced. And so Peter Ellis Beresford is the linguistic anthropologist who wrote the book The Druids, that traces the etymology of the wordage and also traces the Celtic people back to the Indo-European language route, tracing it up to the top of India. And so that's where I get Witta from. It's a title for me. And it's also, I started using it mainly in 2020. Somebody said, we need a street name. And I said, well, Sarah works. And they said, no, it can't be that. And I said, Witta works. And so that's where Witta really started sticking for me. But it's also been a practice for me for years, because for me, I can't base faith off of modern day witchcraft, and modern day Wicca and things like that are very much based off of a couple of books that were very much based off the Catholic Bible and Catholicism, and I don't deal well with that. All of my faith comes from history, where I can piece it together, understanding that most history is written by Christians well after the fact, like the sagas are 300 years after Christianity took the Vikings over, so Christianity influences the way it's written. But an understanding of that, of history, and then archaeology. And then I was raised Turtle Island Indigenous, and I have Turtle Island Indigenous blood, and so I've also incorporated that knowledge within that. And so that's where Witta started for me, is as a practice. I was actually handed the Book of Druids at my first wedding. It was a present for my first wedding, because me and my first husband really studied the Fennan cycle. He was second generation, third generation from Scotland, and his grandfather was Druidic. This slide I will post to my YouTube. Uriel, we are going to get into that a little bit. So, the guy behind me is Cheddarman. Cheddarman is our oldest ancestor in Britain. He's the first Homo sapien in Britain, or the oldest evidence of a Homo sapien we have in Britain, at least until the last year, in which we have found two more, one at 13,000 years ago and one at 14,000 years ago. Pretty much everybody in Britain looked like this at the time. It's not until about 5,000 years ago that we really start to see any prevalence of white skin, and it still is not actually really taking over until a couple of thousand years ago. So the United States society, what is going on within the U.S., is really rooted within ancient Greece, as we were just going over. Most governments don't last longer than a couple years. The British governments lasted the longest, right? But most governments don't last longer than a couple hundred years. The Roman Empire only lasted about 1,000 years, tops, maybe 600 years tops, right? Really, for the main of the Roman Empire. Most places don't last that long. And with the way that the U.S. is heading, who the fuck knows? I know my prevalence, but that doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen. So some of the Russians are Rus, but not all of the Russians. The Scandinavians absolutely sailed down the Russian River Rus and absolutely settled. And then a good portion of Russia is actually Siberian, and a good portion of Russia is actually Mongolia. And, the Russian area was conquered by the descendants of Vikings, but it didn't actually become what we know of as Russia today really as a start until well after that. Like, I think 900 CE is really where we're starting to see. It might be 800. I can't remember that very first king's timeline, but it wasn't, it was well after Orthodox Catholicism had come about that we really start to see a foundation of Russia as a country, and then it really conquers a lot of other spaces to get to the point that it's at now. And within all of those spaces it conquers, it kills and genocides indigenous people. And so by that time, it's not really the Rus anymore. They've taken a whole country and they've, mixed with that country, and then they've mixed up and killed people within that country. And then they've taken over people. But Russia as a whole is not Viking. Its ruling class is descended from the Rus. Turtle as in a sea turtle, a Turtle Island. Turtle Island is North America, is an English translation of a phrase used by many eastern seaboard nations on the eastern seaboard that are Turtle Island indigenous. And it's one of the words that has been kind of translated and kind of been adapted across North America. There are 4 other words, I think. I don't butcher the indigenous languages that they are in. That's why I use the English translation. There are about 4 or 5 indigenous words for Southern Turtle Island as well. I use Southern Turtle Island because, again, I try not to butcher indigenous language. Thank you. I got the drones in. Okay, and so I think that is all those questions. One words are very hard to answer. Like, if you just toss a singular word at me, I don't know what you mean. Just saying. So when we see this mix forward of that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry. So at this time, we've covered how we get to the point of having white skin, right? White skin is an adaptation for a specific latitude on the globe. Taken out of that area, this adaptation fails us and will actually kill you. So it is not an evolution because of the fact that evolution affects the species whole. A and B, evolution is a global thing. Like, if I evolve to breathe better oxygen, that's evolution forward because it applies across the globe. If the skin color doesn't apply across the globe, it's not an evolutionary step forward because it's only an adaptation for a specific area. So we have discussed the fact, we discussed in the beginning, race doesn't exist. The science that proved race is the science that disproved race, the field, my field. Genetics proves that race does not exist. Genetics states that people are more genetically diverse within populations, meaning you're more genetically diverse from your next door neighbor than you are from somebody in a completely different population on the other side of the globe. And this is how we've debunked the theory of race. Race is a societal construct. Culture absolutely exists, and racism has absolutely formed certain societies, and so racism is very structural, and racism absolutely exists. But race itself does not exist. Light skin, again, is not an advantage. It is an adaptation, right? It is only advantageous in a specific space. So when we look at this, and the last space settle, just saying, right? So when we look at how these concepts of exploitation are starting to spread out of the Middle East, we're not looking at people who are white, right? We're not looking at the thought process of white, but what we are looking at is this thought process of chosen. What we are looking at is this thought process that the world is a gift and it's here for us to exploit. Okay, I really like the way that Robin Wall Kimmerer states it in Braining Sweetgrass when she states, on one side of the world was a woman who, was able to help. One woman is our ancestral gardener, a co-creator of the good green world that would be the home of her descendants. This is Sky Woman. The other was an exile, just passing through an alien world on a rough road to her real road in home in heaven. Right? So when you have this idea that this is your test, this is not your home, this is a place that you can exploit, it was given to you, but hopefully you can make it back to the next space and you're God's chosen. You really get this idea that it's okay to exploit. You really get this idea that manifest destiny exists, that it is the destiny that you have that God manifested for you because you are his chosen to have everything, to exploit everything, right? Now, we see early on that when the Bible is working on this, he has the children of Cain, Ham and Ham's descendants. Early on, we see this translate into other cities, right? We see this translate first into Islamic people, after Islam starts, which is really about 400 years after we see the start, or about 200 years after we see the start of Christianity as a state religion, because Christianity becomes a state religion from Constantine in 400, and Islam starts in 600, okay? So what we see is that you really start to see early on this idea that this must be the children of Cain, right? Early on within Christianity's othering, you start to see the Cain coming into play as God's outcast, right? That it's really not anymore that Adam and Eve are God's outcasts, right? Because God has now given them things, right? God has now relieved them of sin in these ways. But the children of Cain are already God's outcasts and will always be because they carry the mark of Cain, right? So initially you see this as Islam. When you see Turtle Island conquered, when you see that start of race starting to develop, is when you see this translate into the idea that the children of Cain are people who are from Africa, that the mark of Cain is dark skin, okay? And so this is where you start to see this idea that dark skin is less than white skin, right? Because you start to see this Christian ideology that Cain being the disgraced, the one who killed his brother, the first murderer, the mark of Cain, right? And the mark of Cain being dark skin, which translates to anything that's not light. And it states that the lighter that you are, the more pure that you are, right? Because you're closer to this ideal of, Adam and Eve had other children that are not Cain and Abel, because, and it's not like there weren't other groups of people out there, because Adam and Eve are God's chosen and were given the Bible, but who the heck do their kids breed with, right? So this group is pure. And so you see this translating down through this manifest destiny, through this ideology, through this Christian confirmation bias, until you get to that idea of race theory. When you get to the idea of race theory is when you start to see this doubling down even stronger, as it becomes not religion but science, right? And both of these things in their time have decided that they are the be all and end all and nothing else exists, right? And so when you're seeing both of these things decide at their time that they are the be all and end all, nothing else exists, they refuse to take accountability from any outside source, you absolutely see this manifest destiny as God's chosen children deserve all of this stuff, and God's chosen children are the ones who are light of skin, and God's marked children are the ones who are dark skin. So you see this translation of this idea of exploitation, this idea of positivity of a lack of education starts at this time. And this idea of a need to, or not need to, but justification based on these things, right? And so when we're looking today at the idea of a culture that is completely founded, and a government that is completely founded on these ideologies, what we're finding is a culture and a government that is completely founded on the ideology that because God chose you, you shouldn't question God. And God's chosen are a specific group. That everything should be founded in God's Bible, and unless you can trace it to God's Bible, it doesn't exist. More. You see this translate down into the idea that if you have the best car, you're the better person. That your morals and your ethics have anything to do with your hair or your skirt length or the height of your heels. You see this translated down into what we are now looking at when we have people who can't quite seem to comprehend common moral decency while screaming at the top of their lungs that they're the only ones with morals. Okay? So when we're looking at a culture that believes that it needs to maintain control over others, a culture that believes that it must, not that it must, but that it has the right to exploit, that has rights without responsibilities, is where we're getting to this point. I want to return a little bit, though, because I did say that I would talk about some of these parallel paths. And we've touched in other lives about some of these parallel paths as well. At the time that Europeans are losing all of their knowledge, all these other countries are advancing their knowledge swiftly. You see that medicine and science is really advancing within Africa, within any country that has Islamic rule, and within very many indigenous countries, right? You see this documented everywhere. You see that Egypt continues to advance, right? It is under Roman rule, but because Egypt being under Roman rule is also not only the breadbasket, but the center of knowledge because of the Library of Alexandria. Now the Library of Alexandria by 400 is gone because the Library of Alexandria, I think, burns with Cleopatra, but the Library of Alexandria after it's burnt is still, like, there's still scrolls collected in a library at Alexandria. It's just not the famous Library of Alexandria, right? And so you see this center of learning because you see this center of food abundance. We see some wars going on in this time where you see Egyptians trying to take back, Zenobia. Queen Zenobia is actually a descendant of Cleopatra, and she tries to take back Egypt from the Romans, right? Well, she is trying to save Palmyra, right? So you see this, these actions of these other groups who are trying to retain independence and are trying to retain scientific and medical advancement. Well, Rome is at the start of Christianity, right? At the start of this stamp out. You do see that Rome has continued it for a while. Rome actually is better at medicine, I think, than ancient Greek is, but not as good as ancient Egypt is. Ancient Egypt is king of medicine. But you see that it is starting to stamp out, right? You're seeing in that early start of Christianity that all of that starts to stamp out. And you see that even before that, there's this fight of independence for so many nations from Rome, as Rome is really taking over the globe, right? And in that fight for independence, you're seeing that groups of people are not, you're seeing that the thinkers are dying too, right? So you're losing knowledge, right? So in Turtle Island, we know that the Mayans are an extremely advanced group. We know the pyramids down in Tenochtitlan. We can see so I don't teach a lot of Turtle Island history. This is not something that I do a lot of contact with because it's Turtle Island, indigenous or not, I'm not a culture keeper. It's not my lane, and it's not something I'm going to teach. I like to give knowledge to Turtle Islanders about new stuff that proves Turtle Island oral traditions to be correct. But that's my gotcha. That's my, hey, cuz, here you go. I found this. Have fun, right? I don't teach Turtle Island indigenous history. We do know, and many people can tell you, that there is this extensive knowledge of agriculture within Turtle Island. And so what I want to touch on is the fact that when Europe finds Turtle Island, we're looking at two places that have gone completely different in the way they're structuring cities. So even with the Pueblo people, even with the Aztec and the Maya, even with the great cities that the Iroquois had, right? Even in these great cities, you are absolutely seeing great cities. You're absolutely seeing great structures. But within them, you're seeing everybody's being fed. The Aztecs have their own little quirk to them, right? The Aztecs have some problematic spaces. The Aztecs have, their sacrificial rites. They're definitely going out and gathering other people up and bringing them home. Almost all early war has that, gathering people up and bringing them home, and now you're slaves. Many places don't use them as sacrifice like the Aztec do, though other places do use them as sacrifice like the Aztec do. Some places, instead of sacrificing slaves or people that they have taken in war, will only sacrifice the willing, right? In some places sacrifice children. Some places throw children into fire like the Middle East. But you do see that there is this exception with the Aztec of going out and grabbing people and bringing them back, of conquering people and committing, not a genocide, because it's not like they still were living alongside the Maya, right? There's still this, there's other Mayan cities. They take one Mayan city, and there's new evidence coming out too that who the Aztec were actually calling the divine were actually a Mayan city, right? So there is some living alongside that you're getting. But the Aztec being the exception, what you're seeing is these big cities that have, and even with the Aztec, what you're seeing is these big cities where all the citizens are eating. The Aztec might not be feeding their slaves, their captives, but they're absolutely feeding their citizens. You're seeing cities, big nations, big cultures that the children that's parents die are not orphans in our sense of orphan, right? They're just, grandmother's taking care of them, or auntie, or the other people within the community, and they are still getting fed, even if none of their blood family is left. There is still people who are like, this child is an important member of our community. Even if all he is doing right now is running around and being a child, and even if all he ever does is pass along his genes, he is still a member of this community, right? And he is still important. You're seeing the elders are treated with respect and love because by the time you've reached elder stage, you've learned enough to be able to pass down, right? You've learned enough to teach the next generation. And you also have a lot of skill and talent that's being put to use, right? You're doing anything that you enjoy doing, right? That is easy, right? You've reached the age that you get to sit around the fire and you get to tell the stories and you get to teach and you get to do fine work, right? But you see within these spaces that everybody is being taken care of. Whereas Europe at this point of time, and we're talking again, the mid, like 400, 500, right? I want to say the mid second millennia, 400, 500. We're seeing in Europe at this time that orphanages are horrid. Orphans are rampant in the street starving. The elders are dying in the street. Disease is everywhere. Poorhouses, there is this form of early chattel slavery kind of going on within Europe at this time. And a lot of times when we talk about things like indentured servitude and stuff like that, one of the things that needs to be mentioned is that the Irish were absolutely slaves in Ireland, right? The British absolutely fucked over the Irish in Ireland, right? You're not seeing Irish slaves in the U.S., and everybody wants to call the indentured servants Irish slaves in the U.S. The indentured servants weren't in the U.S., they were in the British colonies. But you do see that the Irish are absolutely slaves within Britain, right? And you absolutely see this. Even English people are treated with this serfdom that you're not seeing, like that is this serfdom that is an intense level of serfdom, right? It translates into indentured servitude. It is the same thing as indentured servitude. For many people, but for other people, it really becomes this generational thing, especially within like Ireland and stuff like that, where really the people on a land are subject to a lord over generation after generation. What happened in the potato famine, you can absolutely see the absolute torture that's happening with the Irish. But what you're seeing is that you have this level of stratification that puts serfdom at this almost slavery state, but not quite chattel slavery state, right? And this is a more intense form of slavery than you're really seeing anywhere else. We do see slavery everywhere around the globe at this point of time, but slavery everywhere else around the globe is really something that happens when you're caught at war or somebody's raided, and it is something that you earn your way out of and you become a part of the culture, right? Anybody who was taken by the Vikings as a slave, 9 out of 10 of them ends up being a Viking, like ends up having land, ends up marrying into a group, like these things. And we see this translate down in DNA too, right? So a lot of times you're seeing captives taken, they become later, they work off for a period, right? Whereas in Britain at this time, you don't get that period of work off, right? You're always, and your family's always, this is feudalism. So when you see this early form of slavery, chattel slavery, basically this mixture of feudalism with serfdom, right? When you see that translating over into Turtle Island is where you see chattel slavery really starting to double down. And when you get the Europeans getting to Turtle Island, what they're finding in Turtle Island is a group that is not only so advanced in that thought process of food, their slaves are like slaves everywhere else. They're getting out, and a lot of times they're becoming members of the community. Their medicine is very advanced. They're using this advanced herbology. They're using surgery. They have the ability to heal people at an advanced level that you don't see in Europe, right? You only see in Islamic countries at this time, right? And you see that there is this ecology that literally turns north to south, east to west, the entirety of both the Turtle Islands into this garden that is documented from the very beginning. Columbus documents a tended garden as he's stealing 9-year-old girls for sex slaves. In the 100 years before Columbus is landing on the Taino people and the Mayflower landing on Plymouth Rock, we see raids up and down the eastern seaboard. And in these raids up and down the eastern seaboard of Europeans stealing Turtle Islanders as slaves, what we're seeing is that they're documenting it all as a totally tended garden. It's like walking through their gardens back home, except it's a big forest, right? Like it is this, you walk along and you can get berries here, and there's sweetgrass over there, and there's willow over there. There's food everywhere. Honorable harvest is being used, which only takes what you need, and it only takes as a pruning cycle, right? And so you see that this feeds 80 million people. You see that the Taino people that Columbus lands on are 10 million when he lands, and he takes them down to 10,000 in 2 years. But they're in a very small space, and they feed 10 million with their gardens in this very small space, right? Space that he makes run red with blood. You also see within the indigenous Turtle Islanders this Columbus and the Europeans call it naivety. And they liken them to the children of God. That's where we are starting to believe the word Indian actually comes from, because Los de los Indios is what Columbus called the Taino people, the children of God. This is spoken of as, and I hate the second word, but this is the word noble savages, meaning that they aren't civilized like Europeans are, but they are still noble of spirit, and they have these extensive, tended space, right? But they don't see the tended space like they see their mansions, right? And so they toss the savage into it. But everywhere across the globe, what we're seeing is a people who is so in tune with the world around it and so loving in the world around it that it does not see the threat. I talk in here a lot about the fact that if you believe that you're innately evil person, that all humans are innately evil, or all humans are innately fighting bad, or all humans are innately sinful or original sin, if you believe something's innate about you, you can't change it, right? Because it's innate. You can't change what's innate. You can work against it. You can fight against it. We're all fighting against being sinful, right? But if you're innately sinful, you can't change the fact that you're sinful. You can just fight against it. You can always strive for perfection, but you can never be perfect, right? Constant failure, right? The opposite is true. If you have never seen something, you cannot conceive of it. If you do not conceive of this trauma, then you welcome it with open arms. Turtle Islands were conquered by deceit. They were not conquered by courage. They were not conquered by valor. They were not conquered by skill. They were not conquered by weapons that were better, because you could shoot 6 arrows in the time that it took to reload a musket. Turtle Islands were conquered through deceit. Not because Turtle Island indigenous people were lacking in any form of intelligence, but because Turtle Island indigenous people were lacking in malice. Okay? We are looking at groups of people that even war was a game of honor on a level that Europe didn't understand. The Turtle Island indigenous people of the plains have this game that they call counting coup. And counting coup is war, right? When you wear a plains war bonnet, you are wearing a purple heart, right? You have stolen somebody's valor, right? A plains war bonnet is an earned valor, right? Because you have been able to count coup enough, right? Because counting coup, walking up and tapping your enemy and getting away without killing anybody, without getting hit in return, is more skillful, right? It shows more skill. It shows more courage. You have to turn your back to this person you just hit, right? It shows more skill and it shows more courage. So counting coup has more honor than killing somebody. Okay? You're seeing people who do not look on killing as honorable. You're seeing people who overall view rape as a horrific act, where the Europeans view rape as a right because women are subservient to them. So you see a group of people who have no understanding of the atrocity, not because there is any lack of intelligence, but because there is a lack of malice within them. Okay? This is what we see as the parallel path within Turtle Island indigeneity. We know that there are many vast cities here. The Mississippian complex, the Iroquois were a vast city when the Mayflower landed. It's documented. They were part of the forest, but they all lived in these beautiful homes, and there was millions of people, right? And we see that with many spaces down in South America. We see all the mounds across the Turtle Islands. We know many places across the northeast or northwestern seaboard are, cities that were here forever. It's just that the wood, just kind of goes back into the land, especially when it's moist, right? And so what you really see is that there are these advanced civilizations here in Turtle Island that have an advanced level of ecology that Europeans do not have, that have an advanced level of medicine that Europeans do not have, and have an advanced level of science, because it is science that husbands corn from something that looks like wheat to the corn that we see today, right? It is absolutely an advanced level of science that you see here. And then you also see this advanced civilization. The word civilization means civilized. To be civilized means that you treat people civilized. When you are murdering people and slaughtering people and letting children starve in your street, there is nothing civilized about what you are doing. That is not civilized. Care of others is civilized. Civilized is taking care. So civilization was here. There was an advanced civilization here. There was not a civilization in Europe. There was a hellhole in Europe, and it decided to spread because it thought that it had the right to, right? It thought that manifest destiny gave it the right to spread across everything else and kill everybody in its path. So when you see this happening, and you see them first justifying it by biblical mark of Cain, and then justifying it by, you see Africa justified by the biblical mark of Cain, whereas you see Turtle Island justified by the fact that they were too naive for it to matter. So conquering the naive and bringing them to God was, in fact, a good thing, because we were bringing them to God, right? When you see these justifications happen, you see this justification happen within religion. And this justification happens within the bounds of religion, in a religion that is actually pretty horrific at the time. So we like to think that homosexuality is against Christ. But the fact of the matter is nowhere in the Bible does it say jack shit about not flying with another man. What it says is don't have sex with children. And the Romans were offended because the Romans liked to, because they got it from the Greeks, right? And so when they translated the Bible out of the idea of not having sex with children into the idea of not having sex, when it was translated not by the Romans, because it was for the Romans, but when it was translated not by the Romans, they translated it out of not having sex with children into not having sex with men, because I had it right the first time, because the Romans were not okay with not having sex with young men. Right? They wanted to be able to have sex with young men, and so they translated into not having sex with adult males, because it was not okay to have sex with other adult males. It was okay for them to have sex with children. And so they translated into that. And then it translates down to still being very pedophilic, right? Because it's allowed, right? And because it's encouraged, right? And so when we see these translations in the Bible, when we see these things move forward in the Bible, what we're seeing is these justifications moving forward. What we're seeing is these rights moving forward. And when we see this land in Turtle Island and we see the British colonies turning into the United States, what we see is this codified into the Constitution, right? And when we see this codified in the Constitution, what we see is that the Constitution is taken from the Iroquois Constitution, the Five Nations Constitution. And it is stolen and is appropriated, is adapted. And as it's stolen and is appropriated and is adapted, it very much justifies. And in its justification, it gives that manifest destiny right. And it also gives this idea that all these things in the name of God are rights that you're given, right? That God has given you things like the right to life, right? And this is an inalienable right, but what it ignores, the part that it leaves out, is the responsibilities that come with these rights. It gives us the idea that we have this right to life, which we do, but it doesn't give us the idea that we have the responsibility to uphold other people's and other beings' right to life to be able to have our right to life. Because if a right doesn't apply to everybody, it's not a right. So for us to have this inalienable right, then it must apply to everybody. And when we forget the responsibility of upholding these rights for everybody, is when things really start to get into this white. Okay? So you have this kind of convergence at this point of time of a few different factors. You have the convergence of the formation of the ideas of race theory before we've actually codified it as science, right? Because we are talking the early scientists. So some of the people like Jefferson actually helped found the eugenics theory, right? So some of these people are actually a part of this early science that's founding these things. But what we're seeing is slightly before that, because most of this doesn't come until the mid-1800s, the science part of it, right? And slightly before that, what we're seeing is this codification of this as a right that doesn't come with a responsibility, because if I leave out the responsibility, then I'm not responsible to make sure that everybody else is alive. And if I codify this right as only applying to white male landowners, right, then I can make this about me, just like the ancient Greeks did. I can give myself this justification. I have this right to life, and now I have this justification for the shit that I'm doing. So we see this mixing in with this break from Britain, right? And this movement forward into this idea that we are this nation out of manifest destiny. That this is God's, that we're doing God's work, right? That this is what God gave us to do, right? And we see that stealing this Constitution and doubling it down, leaving behind the responsibility. So now we have people who believe that they have a right to own land in a country that's not theirs, because manifest destiny has given them that right. Manifest destiny has given them the right to life without the responsibility to uphold it. And manifest destiny has given them the right to exploit everything around them, because to have this land means I own it. Now we start to see this translate down into everything. We give women in marriage. So now a woman is a man's property. So now a woman is owned. So now love is about ownership and control. So now we believe that we love our children, we must control them and own them, right? So this really translates into everything. And then it really stops being just about being white when we start to see it come into this idea of now we have equality, though we don't, but we think that we do on a surface level, right? Now we have equality, and now we have this American dream because we're number one, which we're not, except for mass incarceration and maternal mortality of an industrialized world, right? Because we have the highest maternal mortality of the industrialized world, maternal mortality rate of the industrialized world, primarily in black women. And we have the highest rate of incarceration, but we're not number one in any fucking other thing. But we have this idea that manifest destiny gives us this right of life and right of pursuit of happiness and right of liberty, which makes us number one, which gives us this right to ownership. And that not only do we have this right to ownership, but now we have the right to own a 2-bedroom house and a car. And now we have the right to have that 2-bedroom house and that car and a brand new TV every year and a brand new phone every year, right? So now this snowballs into this idea that what I own defines me. Because I have this right to land, and it's this right to land and land ownership that gives me this right to citizenship, right? Even though we know that's not, but we still have this idea that once you own land, you're a higher rank. You're a higher class of person. You own this, right? You have this, right? And once you own land, it's your property. You can do whatever the fuck you want to it, so you can exploit it, right? Once I own my wife, I can exploit her. Once I own my husband, I can control him, right? And now ownership becomes rank, so now you must have the next thing. You have to have the best thing, right? But all of this stuff is given to you by God, so you can't question God. So now you can't learn anything outside of what your Bible is teaching you. So you can't learn the real shit of what's going on. Any form of accountability is going to tell you that you're wrong and make you maybe look at the fact that maybe you don't need 5 cars or a dick-shaped rocket to the moon, right? So you can't look at this stuff. You can't look at it any deeper, because if you look at it any deeper, it loses its reality, right? Like, once you get below the surface, it breaks. Just like the idea that race exists below the surface of our skin, right? Once you get below the surface, once you get to the genetics and past the skin, you see that race doesn't exist. Once you get below the surface and realize that even if God gave you the fucking planet, destroying a gift is rude as fuck, right? Like, once you get to that point, once you break through that surface, you have to face it, the fact. So now you get to the willful ignorance that we are seeing today. Now you get to the willful lack of accountability, the willful lack of other people having to take accountability, and the idea that it's a golden bubble. Don't break it. You can get in as long as you don't break it, but don't break the golden bubble. And don't look any deeper, because if you look any deeper, you'll see it's not real gold. It's not even silver. And that's where we get to why white, and why is white, and how why is white translates down through generations of exploitation, through generations of the idea that because you're special and chosen, you don't have to take care of anything or anyone else. You just get to exploit everything around you. That this is just a world you're passing through that you can exploit until you get to your home in heaven, right? And this willful ignorance that we see. I will open it back up and see if there's any questions. I don't have much more, though I'll probably answer questions and maybe come up with some more. Again, this is the first time we're discussing this, and this has to do with a lot of things that I've been asked recently. Just make me, I actually saw the question, why is white, the other day, and went, oh, I can answer that question. So that's why we're here. And again, this is a new lecture. We will be uploading this on, I will be uploading this on YouTube after this. And so anybody who wasn't able to be here for the whole thing can see it. Oh, I'm sorry, Gong. Let me, it should have it set up to where my subscribers can, but let me go ahead and follow you back so that you have the ability to. It's not on subscribers only, is it? Let me double check. I might have put it on subscribers only by accident. I did. Okay, sorry. Now everybody can talk. I apologize. I did not mean to do that. So, sorry. Now I've opened it up. Again, I don't deal with racism very well, and I don't deal with phobias based on gender and desire very well. You will not like my response. And kindness is key in this space, please. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I will be uploading it to YouTube, but if I was to start again, we would end up here for another 3 hours. And as much as you guys are all fun and everything, my game is calling me too, and I really don't want to spend that many hours. Ghost DNA for unknown species. That is seen because we have like fingerprints of other species in our DNA, but we haven't found them in the fossil record. And we have about 7 other species, Neanderthal, Denisovian, and 5 ghost species within our DNA. And that's because we don't fight things, we fuck them. We like unusual things. We're always attracted to something that doesn't look like us or normal. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me look back and see what it was saying. Which were you trying to clarify with me, Gong? I didn't see that part. I'm so sorry. Forgot the questions. Absolutely. So a quick recap is that race doesn't exist, and that the idea of white is more recent, and that the exploitative culture that is locusting, right, that is plastic, that's just devouring as much as it can, really starts in the Middle East, and then translates down through religion and then into race theory, manifest destiny in the United States, idea that God's chosen, therefore get the ability to exploit and kill everybody else because they're God's chosen. And that's kind of the recap. I'm going to post this to YouTube so that you can see the whole thing, because that's a very brief recap that probably doesn't hit half of it. They can't DNA hair from 4,000 years ago, but they can DNA bones from 4,000 years ago. You're so welcome, Wen. I'm playing Sims right now because it's something I can be an absolute... I have real hard safety issues, which is why I'll disappear for a little bit on TikTok too, because I have safety issues, mentally safety issues, because I have really bad PTSD, and then I have complex PTSD on top of it. So I disappear. And Sims is like, I can completely control it. Nothing bad can ever happen. I'm not going to fight something. I like playing like things like Assassin's Creed, but when it becomes really bad, trying to sword fight becomes really hard in my head, because I've actually stood shield walls where shields and batons were used and shit like that. And so like it just flashes me back. How does whiteness finally take accountability, like face itself and undo? Absolutely beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to turn this off for a minute just so that I can actually, that's a beautiful question, and I want to go ahead and do that without getting into, and actually it's something else I wanted to go over tonight, so I'm glad it's there. So how does whiteness finally take accountability, like fakes itself and undo? So again, I want to state that white doesn't necessarily mean your skin color, okay? Just like you can be indigenous and light skin like I am, and just like, anything else, we have a few very beautiful examples, well, not beautiful examples, we have a very few very explicit examples currently in the media of people who are upholding white supremacy ideals who are not white people, right? And so you can absolutely see that whiteness is not just about the skin. It is about a concept, right? It is about the idea that white skin is a supreme thing. White skin is an evolutionary advantage. It is the things that uphold the idea that whiteness gives you the reason to exploit. So as we're leaving religion and we're getting into other ideas of othering, right? Because we're no longer in this religious, like everybody's one religion or the other like we were. And we can't really other based on religion here in the U.S. as much. I mean, we still do, but we're not supposed to, because, that's what it says. So now you have to get it into something else, right? And so now you see it really start to be about skin color, right? But again, you can absolutely see where it's coming across into other spaces. But if you can uphold the supremacist idea that these concepts, that the concepts that are attributed to Europeans are the right concepts, right? while discouraging the other concepts, the concepts of black people, the concepts of indigenous people. If you can uphold that, then you can uphold your white supremacist ideas and you can uphold the structure that's currently going on. The way to dismantle that is to talk the fuck about it, to point it out, to, say that's mighty white of you, whether you're white, black, or indigenous, right? The way to talk about it is to point out the things that come from this exploitative idea, that come from this capitalist idea. It doesn't matter what your skin color happens to be. We see within every space that people who take leadership roles, no matter what their skin color is, very frequently use those leadership roles as a method to exploit, as a method to get money, as a method to be at the forefront, instead of actually like doing the help and the things that they're saying that they're doing, right? So it's not just about the skin tone. It is absolutely about the culture thought process of white, because white has become a culture to some extent, right? Now, I want to specify that when you're saying shit like I'm proud to be white, that's problematic, because at that point what you're proud of is your ability to maintain this upper level echelon with privilege, right? What you're proud of is that you have the privilege not to be harmed, right? So when people are sitting here going, white's not a culture, in the attempt to show how black is a culture within the U.S. because of the shared experience within the U.S., I want to point out that white as a culture is this exploitative capitalist thought process culture, but it's not about the skin color. It's about the Western ideology, okay? Just because of the fact that this can become something that can be twisted and used in different ways. It can be used as, well, only white people are doing this, so everybody else using capitalist and exploitative behaviors gets a pass, which does not help anybody, right? And we know that, right? It can be used as, well, that means that we are superior. So, we have culture and we can't say we're proud to be white now, right? So I'm trying to double down. You can't use it in either of those ways. Don't be an ass, right? The culture is exploitative. The culture is plastic. The culture is, what more can I accumulate? How much shit can I hoard? Right? That's the culture. The culture of supremacy granting the idea that you get to have more where other people are in pain, right? Because the supremacy tells you that you can have more where other people are in pain, then you are losing the battle. You're losing the battle, right? You're losing the battle across the globe because you're killing us, right? So we talk about it. We talk about it, and then we start demanding accountability across the board as a forefront on every fucking action. We don't demand accountability as culture. We don't demand accountability as humans, right? We excuse shit. Well, their trauma did that. Well, culture did that. Well, that was what it was like back then. So, we're not going to be pissed off that Thomas Jefferson raped a 15-year-old and kept her locked in his basement while he impregnated her over and over and over again. We're not going to be pissed about that because that was the time. Why not? I don't give a shit if it was the time. Until we can take a look at the other times and hold the accountability in the action, then we can't change the accountability in the action. And if we don't change the accountability in that action, we can't hold future inaccountable, right? We cannot hold the future actions accountable if we haven't held the past actions accountable, because there's always the excuse that somebody else fucking did it, or it was just a time, or it was acceptable because of this. It's never acceptable to kill other people. I don't give a shit what time you're in. 300,000 years of existence, it's never been acceptable to kill other people. We have certain timelines where people were in power and utilized that. But it was never fucking acceptable. right? So we start to hold accountability. We start to demand it. And then the other and the last thing is we start to return power to Indigenous voices. Land back. That is the answer for very much everything, right? It is the answer for climate destruction. It is the answer for accountability. It is the answer for equity, right? Because that's what indigeneity does. Though we have to be careful. Again, whiteness isn't about your skin color. Whiteness is about whether or not you partake in this capitalistic exploitative culture, right? So we have to make sure that the people that we are granting that respect and that honor to are not people who are following that exploitative nature. And I don't mean respect and honor as giving land back to Indigenous people, because that's a bare minimum. It's not respect and honor. I mean respect and honor as choosing leaders for this particular thing, right? Like when leaders in that are chosen, we need to make sure that the leaders within that are directing that forward are not people who are acting with a white thought process, right? With a capitalistic European thought process. Now, why is this a white thought process? It's a European thought process. This shit starts in Europe, right? It starts in the Levant, right? But when it gets to the point where it's about skin color, right? When it gets to the point where it's about exploitation of others based on skin color, it is absolutely European. And then it absolutely comes down into, well, it's Europeans' exploitation of America or the Turtle Islands, and then it translates into the United States after they take over, right? So it is absolutely coming from European thought process and European culture. And it's not Western. I don't want to use Western. Turtle Islands is the West, right? And this is not a Turtle Island thought process. Western science is not Turtle Island science, right? So I don't like the use of Western European, but again, it didn't start in Western Europe. It just started at this point in Western Europe, but the science starts in the Middle East and the Near East, right? So it is exploitative capitalism. And it is the idea that we can take and take and take. And how we get rid of it is taking accountability ourselves, where and when we need to, no matter our skin color, of what that accountability needs to look like in our own life about exploitation, capitalism. Do we look at our partner as our property? Do we look at our children as our property? Do we look at the world around us as us versus them? Are we looking in our neighbor's bowl to make sure that they have enough, or are we looking to make sure they don't have more than us? Right? So it absolutely starts with taking accountability for where that exploitative shit is within your own life. And then it starts with holding it accountable in other people's. And then it's talk. We have been silent too long. We've been silent too long, right? Somebody was talking about, and I think they said it was Sidney Poitier, who had said, the way to stop the conversation of race is to stop talking about it. But the problem is that he is from a prior generation that believed that silence was the answer to everything. And silence is not the answer to everything. Silence is violence, because silence accepts. Stop making it acceptable. And stop making it acceptable on a wide fucking scale. Don't just stop making it acceptable because we protested in the streets for a year. Over fucking turn the government. Put people in power who will actually fucking work for the people. Get all those old people out of there who are working on prior thought processes, right? I mean, personally, I'm a burn it to the ground person, but I'm not going to sit here and encourage a revolution, because that's just not my gig, right? I don't want to lead it, so I'm not going to encourage it. But, there are several ways, but really it starts with our self-accountability. And it starts with holding everybody else accountable and shouting that shit. Now, that's white. Keep your exploitation to yourself. Rights include responsibilities. Stop taking. You don't need a new iPhone every year, right? It really starts with that. Stop taking all the fucking toilet paper. Who the fuck takes the toilet paper in a goddamn nose-blowing pandemic? Why wasn't it the tissues, right? Hold people accountable. And hold yourself accountable and scream it from the fucking hilltops. And realize that it is not about skin. It is about culture. It is about the white American culture that everybody has the ability to attain, right? Doesn't matter your skin tone. Many people were forced into attaining it, right? It is about the culture that says exploitation is my job. Exploitation is the right that I got when I got pursuit of happiness. I don't have responsibilities. Okay. We are the original people. We said, let there be white. I mean, light. That's real bond. You're very welcome. So nobody ever said you evolved from apes. We have a last common ancestor with apes. I know it's kind of weird to some people, but we did all evolve. You're just an animal. And the idea that you're not just an animal is part of the problem. The idea that you're not just another one of this niche, that this biosphere that is, has anything you could ever need within it, right? That you're supposed to be tending and caring for and helping because that's your niche within it. That's your true purpose on this planet, is to care for and tend the environment. The idea that you're better from and is set apart, that's the exploitation process that we're talking about. That's your special process. The belief that you're set apart and you're not just another animal tells you that it's okay to kill other things because you're better, and you're not better. You're just not. We're not better. In fact, I would argue that there are several animals that are better than we are. So I think that this is nothing to do with evolution. I think that this has to do with an experiment that's gone badly wrong. I think Western agriculture and the advent of cities was actually a bad experiment that started with confirmation bias and failed in its first testing and has fucked us up every step of the way, and it causes the climate destruction that we're in, and that we need to actually acknowledge that it failed. I think we need to acknowledge that it failed. I do believe that we're constantly evolving, but we're not going to speciate because we adapt our adaptations, and so we have no need to speciate. We're not going to do a whole lot of adaptation based on most forms of environment like skin color adaptation, but we might adapt our oxygen ability because of the fact that we are killing the oxygen content in the air. My YouTube is in Witta. There is a link tree in my bio as well, and the link tree actually has a link to my YouTube so that you can find it, but it is the same as my TikTok. It just might not have the periods. No, you're fine. I love the Sims too. They're my favorite. The social science theory of race. So the social science theory of race, I think that has more to do with culture. I would have to look up the social science theory of race to figure it out a little bit more. I'll go ahead and look it up, but I'm not sure what the social science theory of race is as opposed to the biological theory of race, but I'll take a look. Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate it, Gong. Hey, my darling. Elephants are better. Elephants are compassionate and kind. Dolphins are better. Whales are better. Yeah, it's all a construct. Okay, so, and that was the last place I wanted to take that. And so with that being the last place I want to take it, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'll go ahead and open it up for a couple more minutes and see if there's any other questions. And then I'm just going to go ahead and take off for the night and go play my game and warm up, and maybe my baby will call me because he's probably going to be on break soon. Let me go ahead and open up comments to everybody. Also, if you are a subscriber, we are going to be doing one subscriber only live a week. At minimum, we did one on Monday. I'm going to try and do a later evening one later this week. I just don't know exactly when because I'm having a hard time this week getting online. But I will make sure and put it out so I can try and do a late night subscribers only chat or subscribers only live. I'm going to try and make sure that we have a focus within that because I think it got a little bit disfocused last time, but we will be doing a subscriber only live a week, and subscriber only lives are for more in-depth questioning and to help kind of guide the way the channel itself goes. 12 a.m. where, Gong? It is 11 p.m. where I'm at right now. Dogs. We see that dogs, I think we're looking at like starting like 10,000 years ago, but I don't know enough like about other species. Like really, I just focus on our evolution. So I really couldn't tell you enough about dogs. 204 in DC, yeah. Yeah, it's across. We have so many different time zones in this country. But I will try. I'm trying to do like 8 p.m. Pacific Standard to midnight Pacific Standard is what I'm trying to do at least one night a week for subscribers so that there are both day and nights. Absolutely. Sorry. I'm not sure if I meant. Oh, yeah, the dogs. Dogs are better. You're so correct. Dogs are better. And cats are absolutely better too. Cats are better, and cats have better communication skills than human beings. Cats started talking out loud because of us. Because they needed to talk to us because we didn't hear anything. Hey, Rosie. So I'm not going to go into another breakdown because we've been talking for 3 hours, but I am uploading this. As soon as I get off, I'll download it and upload it to YouTube tonight. The YouTube channel is in the link tree in my bio, and so you can do the Why is White voyage. I will be doing this again a couple times. This is just our first one, but I don't want to go into another 3 hours at this point. Yeah, but I like cats. They're awesome. I'm always asking why. I'm not sure why cats and dogs like us, except for the fact that we bred them too. Cats started out as African servile cats, and dogs started out as wolves, and like we bred them to be more a part of us. This is Chitterman. This is the prior oldest find in England. We just this year had 2 more finds, one at 14,000 and one at 13,000 years ago. But Chitterman is 10,000 years ago. And he belonged to a group of early hunter-gatherers who looked pretty much like him. And about 10% of the European population is descended from that group of people. And he actually has a direct descendant alive in England 300 generations down. White skin isn't really about scavenging for survival. It's more about, and you're going to see that light skin actually has a lot of crops where you might see that some darker skin areas don't have a lot of crops. It's more about the vitamin D in this sun, or, the presence of the sun and cloud cover than it is about anything else. Whether or not you get direct sunlight, than it is really about anything else. It's an adaptation. It's not an evolution. The evolution is the fact that we can adapt. I do believe cats are about 7,000 years old, and we do see them starting in early Egypt. Like it's actually the cats of the African savanna, or I know it's a species of cat that's from Africa. Pale skin is an extremely recent adaptation. That's what we were talking about as well, is that really pale skin doesn't become common, and then common, not the major, but common until about 5,000 years ago, even in northwestern Europe. Josh, most of whom around the Mediterranean. Not Chitterman. Chitterman is actually in Britain. And the group of people that he's a part of is all in Britain. So white skin is not a mutation. So our skin has this really cool evolutionary ability that we get from Homo erectus. And that is that we get to adapt our skin depending on what latitude region we're in. And so it's not an advantage because it only works in specific areas. So it's not like an advantage or even an evolution, but it's just this ability to adapt our skin depending on what area along the equatorial regions we're in. I'm wondering personally, with bronze skin, if bronze, the shade of bronze, actually doesn't come from the ghost species that we see within Turtle Island indigenous people. I also wonder if the X1 mitochondrial DNA comes from the ghost species that we see within Turtle Island indigenous people, and that's why the X2 is in Siberia. And if you look at the top of the globe, you can see that there's like the ability to for people in the Arctic to cross the ice in the islands up there. And so we were talking about boat people who already had like dog sleds and stuff like that. And the X1 gene starts in Turtle Island and then goes to Siberia. So, you know, I kind of wonder. The Homo erectus heritage, yeah, so the melanin really, so with the tanning, what it is the ability to bring that melanin to the forefront in the skin to kind of protect for a minute, you know, like you're kind of burning it, like you're toasting it, right? And so it kind of just brings it up to the top of the skin, basically, is my understanding. This is not my area of expertise. I have to state that the way that how our skin and the timeline adapting is absolutely something that I've studied, but why we tan is not really something I've done a whole lot of study in. There is a YouTube channel, Enwida Ord, same as this, and it is in the link tree in my bio. So adaptation is something that adaptation is a single thing that you adapt to a single environmental stimulus. Speciation comes from, so evolution is that either forward movement of a species whole or it's the movement into a separate species, right? And so an adaptation that doesn't benefit the species whole is not evolutionary. It's just an adaptation, right? And a mutation is where something goes sideways. The gene for white skin, though, comes from Homo erectus, just like this gene from dark skin comes from Homo erectus, because Homo erectus had that ability too. So it's not that it mutated, right? And so it's not a mutation, and it's not an evolution because it doesn't help everybody. Because if you have this skin and you go to the Sudan until currently, when you can actually, you know, have some protection in other areas, it would not help you. It would be a hindrance. And so it's not something that actually helps anywhere outside of the European spaces that it's in. And it just helps there because it's easier to get vitamin D. So there is a current ghost species as they are talking about that you probably saw come across the thing, and it's a European ghost species. This is something I saw a week ago. I have not gotten too deep into it yet. I am looking for articles that give a deep dive on it and have not found the articles that give the deep dive that I want on it to find out what they know of the ghost species. But that's a new one. So it would mean that we actually have 8 species in us. But I don't know yet whether or not that's the one that they're talking about before in Neanderthal and Denisovian, or this is one that's actually within Homo sapiens. So I'm kind of trying to dig into it to find out more about that ghost species. Gong, the link tree in my bio has articles. I don't do books because by the time the books are published, the information is out of date. And so I do articles. But there are a lot of articles in the link tree in my bio that will give you a base to start with and give a little bit of information. There is not much more to the genetic difference between people than skin color. And the genetic difference between people isn't even skin color dependent. The skin color is latitude dependent. But the differences between people on a genetic level go no deeper than a couple of adaptations for different latitudes. So those adaptations are not just skin color. 4C hair is an adaptation for plain savanna desert living, because there was a black anthropologist who recently did a study and found that 4C hair actually creates this kind of shade over the top of the hair, and then it creates this lattice work for airflow. So it'll cool the scalp in an area where you've got the sun beating down. The inner fold of the eye, the emphatic fold that you see in Arctic regions, is because when the sun reflects off the snow, it will cause snow blindness. Without that, the blue eyes are a low light adaptation, whereas dark eyes were the speciation that we had with the dark skin in Africa because of the highlight situation. But those are the only difference in the genes depending on the region, really. I mean, there might be certain things that are, like family line things, but you're still going to be more genetically different than other people within the population than you are going to be within people between populations. For example, the Y mitochondrial, or not mitochondria, the Y DNA for the Picts is found not only in Scotland and in Ireland, but in Iberia and in the Basque and in Turkey. And that's the Y DNA for the Pictish people, and it makes it all across the globe. But so you're going to see that you can be in northern Scotland and in Turkey and still have the same Y DNA, right? So this is what we're talking about, that the genetic differences within populations are greater than between populations. This specific picture is Cheddarman. Cheddarman is one of the oldest finds in Britain. He was our oldest find until this year, where we found two more, one at 13 and one at 14,000 years old. This is his DNA, the evidence based on his DNA, what he looked like. Thank you so much, Nana. Yes, there are three ghost species within Africa. So most of Africa has Neanderthal within them, except for two spaces, one within South Africa and one within West Africa. And those spaces have three ghost species. Everybody has admixture from other species. None of us are pure. We've all got this admixture because we're really curious as a species. And every time we see something new, we have sex with it because we like new things. And it's not a gene, it's a species. A ghost species is something that we see, and I only because somebody else said ghost gene, not because I'm trying to correct you. It's a species that we see a fingerprint of them, a smudge of them in our DNA, but we haven't found them in the fossil record yet, and we don't know who they were. So we know this other species exists, but we don't know anything other than the fact that we see them. Aboriginal, I'm not sure about that. I've never seen anything like that. I do know that race doesn't exist. Caucasian people might have come from a group of people coming from somewhere else. I mean, obviously, because they came out of Africa, but albino and white skin are two totally different genes. I don't think I go over epigenetics a whole lot. I'm not a geneticist. Like, I can debunk the theory of race because I was told how. Like, because my teachers taught me, right? And taught me how we did it. Because anthropology is the field that created the theory of race. And so many of my teachers, actually, I was really lucky. I had a lot of women of color that were teaching me: Asian, Black, Indian, and Turtle Island Indigenous. And so they really focused on things like that, and so in our trying to, hold our own field accountable and move forward, it's one of those things that we really talk about a lot. And so I only understand genetics and how this was done because it's how it was taught to me, right? Because DNA and stuff like that, my brain doesn't work right with them. It's a series of letters and numbers that don't make a word. If it doesn't make a word, my brain doesn't work. Certain body shapes are also climate adaptations, and not just climate adaptations, but space adaptations. We've talked about island dwarfism and island giganticism, where a space, if you have a high or low presence of food and a low presence of predators and a low presence of space, you'll go dwarf. If you have a high presence of those things, you'll go large. And also we saw, like we've talked about within the Neanderthals, when they speciate really short and compact because less skin retains heat better. One of skin's jobs is to release or dissipate and retain heat. And when you have less of it, it retains it better. And when you have more of it, it dissipates it's better. We talk about this when we talk about how Homo sapiens and Neanderthal speciate, because Homo sapiens speciate tall and lean to dissipate heat, where Neanderthal speciate short and compact to retain heat. But when we talk about race, people talk about race not based on body shape and body type and your hair and your eyes. They use those as the surface, but then they decide that those things determine whether or not you feel pain, whether or not you're intelligent, whether or not you're good at sports, whether or not you're a good cook, whether or not you're subservient, whether or not you can do all of these other things, right? We look at these, and instead of seeing the adaptations to a space, we see them as a deeper adaptation of the species, and they're not. That's, I think, the really important thing. We're looking at physical phenotypes as meaning brain capacity, and physical phenotypes have nothing to do with brain capacity. And when people are sitting here going, genetics are more different within than between, they're not talking about the 5 genetics that you see. They're talking about everything else, right? There's something like 25,000 genes that are individual in the human body, right? That are the species genes, right? And like 5 of them are the one that everybody decides matters, right? They don't distinguish anything but those 5 things, right? And so we do adjust other things, absolutely. But the idea that that means anything deeper than I am going to be better off in this area, and the idea that it means an evolutionary stage, because again, evolution is something that applies across a species. It works everywhere. And adaptation is something that works specific to a specific area, right? Denisovian are human. Anything that is a homo is human. Homo means human. So Homo denisovian, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo Neanderthal, Homo naledi. These are all humans. Homo literally means human. That's the meaning of the word. OCAB 2, I'm not sure what that one is. Ethnicity is more about culture and region than anything else. It's not about internal genetics. Like, many people don't realize that Spanish people are actually blonde-haired and blue-eyed. Okay, people from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, are actually very light. You do see that the Moors come in from North Africa and take over the Iberian Peninsula for a period of time in the late thousands to early 1200s, something like that, right? And so you do see a little bit of that genetics in some people within Spain, but most people within Spain are actually very light. If you look at Mexico here within Northern Turtle Island, Latinx, Latin is considered an ethnicity, right? Because people within Latin conquered countries are Latin, right? And so it's considered an ethnicity, but you can have people who are extremely pale who are ethnically Mexican, but not racially indigenous, right? Because most people think of Latin people from South America or from Mexico as being dark of skin, because what you're seeing is the mix of the Spanish with the colonizer with the indigenous people that are already there, right? And so you can be Latin and be pale or dark, right? And that's your ethnicity, because it's about your nation and your culture, all of this rolled up into one. Culture being something that micros, right? So your ethnicity might be American, right? Because it's about the nation and the culture within America, right? Whereas culture within America is not it's not singular, right? So the ethnic might be American because it's the overall, but the culture is going to be indigenous culture, Black culture, European culture, right? Blue eyes come about as a low light adaptation, and we absolutely see blue eyes in Homo sapiens before we see light skin in Homo sapien. So we can't, so they absolutely have this new advent that came out in the last 2 years, and it's how they reconstructed Denny from her DNA too. They absolutely have this new thing that they've, and I don't remember the name of it. I read the articles on it, and I think that that article is in the link tree. I'll double check. But they have this new process with DNA where they can tease out the genetics from the DNA and actually do an AI rendering of what somebody looks like based on the DNA genetics. And so we absolutely have developed the ability to look at a likeness through the reconstruction of the gene. So like if you have the gene for freckles, we're going to apply freckles to you. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that you displayed the gene for freckles just because you had it. So yes, there's going to be a little bit of leeway, but this is going to be the closest that you're going to possibly get. It is a corporation, not a country. This is very true. Black people didn't dominate Europe during the Dark Ages. That's not what the Dark Ages were. I know that there is some thought process that happened, but that's just not true. Um, so the Dark Ages is like a couple hundred years during the, I think it's like, I think actually Vikings is really the Dark Ages. Like I think it like starts in the 500s, right? And it's really about this kind of a micro ice age where there's like a lack of sun, but it's also about this lack of knowledge because Christianity has stomped out knowledge. And so really it's this mix of this environmental factor and this domination from Rome. But you're not seeing Africa having moved into Europe and dominating anything. You are seeing Charlemagne, who's a Francia king, right? Who's I think, so I want to say Celtic, but you're not seeing Black people during the Dark Ages. By the time we get to the Dark Ages, we're looking at, again, 500 I think is when it starts, Common Era. So we're looking at European being predominantly light skinned, probably at about 1000 BCE. So you're going to see that, and still there's going to be some people who are dark, because even in the Viking ages, we see a lot of people who are dark. And we absolutely see like Egil is dark of skin, right? So we do still see dark. It's just that you get that shift from being predominantly black with minorly white to predominantly white with minorly black. And then during the before the Dark Ages, so you're going to see that shift starting, or the predominance of light skin being at about 1000 years before Common Era. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. I do have something in my nose. If you have a problem with people based on their appearance teaching you, it's because that you have a moral or ethic issue. You should not have to be physically attracted to me to hear. And personally, I am not out here trying to attract anybody. That's not my game. Too spirited, first of all. You think you see a girl, you think you see a white girl. That is not what the fuck I am. You know. Oh, not a whole lot on the Polynesian people, unfortunately. I'm sorry. My references are in the link tree in my bio. People are always going to be mad when science doesn't support their, I get trolled so often, let me tell you. That's why we keep the comments off most of the lives, because these can be extremely trolly. Thank you very much. No, I'm white assumed. You assume I'm white. I'm indigenous, but you assume I'm white. I'm going to go ahead and upload this to YouTube. So it will be uploaded tonight. So you will be able to rewatch it. We'll go over it again in a couple of days when I come back in. Yeah, usually it's off, so I don't need a moderator. I think I have a couple. But have a great night. May it be blessed. Remember, accountability is key. We can change everything if we just start taking accountability and holding each other accountability. And remember that we are innately nurturing, communal, and curious. If we can take care of each other and love each other, we can get through this and we can move forward. Have a great one, guys.